Unlike philosophers who treated suffering as an unfortunate byproduct of life, Schopenhauer argued that pain represents the very essence of existence. He constructed a systematic psychology that explains why humans remain perpetually dissatisfied despite their achievements, and why temporary pleasures always give way to renewed misery. His insights penetrate beneath surface appearances to reveal the unconscious forces that drive human behavior. Modern psychology and neuroscience have validated many of his observations about desire, motivation, and the limited effectiveness of external solutions to inner turmoil. This analysis examines Schopenhauer's psychology of suffering in precise detail, exploring how he understood pain not as an accident, but as an inescapable feature of consciousness itself. His work reveals the hidden mechanisms that trap people in cycles of wanting and disappointment. More importantly, he identified specific methods for reducing suffering through changes in perception and behavior. These insights remain startlingly relevant to anyone seeking to understand why human happiness proves so elusive and what can be done about it. Part 1. The will to live as the root of all suffering. Schopenhauer identified a blind, irrational force operating beneath all existence that he called the will to live. This will has no intelligence, no plan, and no ultimate purpose beyond perpetuating itself. Think of it as a cosmic hunger that devours everything in its path, while never achieving satisfaction. Every living creature becomes a temporary manifestation of this force, driven by urges and desires they cannot control or fully understand. The will operates through what Schopenhauer called objectification. It creates individual beings as vehicles for expressing itself in the physical world. A hungry lion stalking prey represents the will objectified in one form. A human desperately seeking love represents the same will objectified in another form. Neither the lion nor the human chosen their desires or created their needs. These urges arise from a deeper source that uses them as instruments for its own continuation. Consider sexual desire as the clearest example of how the will manipulates individuals for its own purposes. When someone feels overwhelmed by romantic longing, they imagine this emotion serves their personal happiness. They believe they want companionship, intimacy, and mutual understanding. Schopenhauer revealed this as an elaborate deception orchestrated by the will to ensure reproduction. The will creates the illusion of personal choice while actually hijacking consciousness to serve biological imperatives. People fall in love not because they decide to, but because the will requires them to produce offspring. This deception operates through multiple layers of self-justification. The young man pursuing a woman tells himself he seeks her intelligence, kindness, or spiritual connection. In reality, the will has identified her as genetically suitable for producing healthy children. Her physical beauty, which seems like an aesthetic preference, actually signals reproductive fitness to unconscious biological processes. Her personality traits, which appear to match his values, actually complement his genetic weaknesses to create stronger offspring. The entire elaborate courtship ritual serves reproduction while masquerading as personal fulfillment. The same pattern applies to parental love, which people experience as the most selfless emotion possible. Parents sacrifice time, money, and energy for their children, believing this demonstrates their noble character. Schopenhauer showed that parental devotion represents another trick played by the will to ensure species survival. The overwhelming urge to protect and nurture offspring arises not from personal choice, but from biological programming designed to maximize reproductive success. Parents become willing slaves to their children because the will requires this behavior to continue its existence into the next generation. The emotions feel genuine and meaningful, but they serve purposes entirely different from what consciousness imagines. Even seemingly non-biological desires trace back to the will's fundamental drive for existence and dominance. The businessman working 16-hour days believes he seeks financial security or professional recognition. Actually, the will drives him to accumulate resources that improve his status and reproductive prospects. The artist suffering for her craft imagines she serves beauty or truth. In reality, the will uses artistic talent as a display mechanism to attract mates and social allies. Every human ambition, when examined closely, reveals itself as a disguised expression of the will's blind urge to perpetuate itself. This creates a profound existential trap that few people recognize. Individuals believe they pursue goals they have chosen for reasons they understand. They construct elaborate narratives about their values, dreams, and life purposes. Meanwhile, the will manipulates them through desires they cannot control toward ends they never consciously selected. A person spends decades climbing the corporate ladder, believing they seek achievement and success. The will simply uses career ambition as a vehicle for social dominance and mate attraction. The individual exhausts themselves pursuing something they think they want, while actually serving a master they never acknowledged. This explains why so many people feel empty after achieving their stated goals. The will ensures its continued dominance by making its operations invisible to consciousness. People experience desires as arising from their personal identity and rational reflection. They construct sophisticated justifications for behaviors that actually stem from unconscious biological imperatives. The hungry person believes they eat because food tastes good, not because the will requires nutrition for survival. The ambitious person believes they seek success because they value achievement, not because the will demands social dominance. This systematic self-deception prevents individuals from recognizing their true situation and taking steps to escape it. Modern evolutionary psychology confirms many aspects of Schopenhauer's analysis while adding scientific precision to his insights. Research demonstrates that human behavior is indeed shaped by unconscious forces designed to promote survival and reproduction. Studies show that people consistently underestimate how much their choices are influenced by biological drives, social instincts, and environmental pressures. Brain imaging reveals that emotional and unconscious processes often determine decisions before conscious reasoning begins. These findings support Schopenhauer's claim that the will operates largely beneath the threshold of awareness, manipulating consciousness to serve its own purposes. The scientific evidence validates his intuition that human beings are far less free and self-directed than they believe. Part 2. The pendulum between desire and boredom. Human consciousness swings perpetually between two poles of misery that Schopenhauer identified as want and boredom. When people lack something they desire, they suffer from the active pain of longing and frustration. When they obtain what they sought, they experience brief relief before falling into the passive emptiness of boredom. This mechanical oscillation continues throughout life, creating the illusion of choice while actually representing a form of psychological imprisonment. Consider the experience of hunger, which provides a clear example of this pendulum in action. The hungry person feels genuine distress as their body demands nutrition. They focus intensely on food, imagining that eating will bring satisfaction and peace. The act of eating does provide temporary relief, but this pleasure exists only in the transition from hunger to satiation. Once full, the person quickly loses interest in food and begins seeking other forms of stimulation. Within hours, hunger returns, restarting the entire cycle with mechanical predictability. The same pattern governs romantic relationships with devastating psychological consequences. The single person suffers from loneliness, believing that finding a partner will solve their emotional problems. They idealize romantic love as the key to lasting happiness and spend enormous energy pursuing relationships. When they successfully attract someone, they experience a brief period of excitement and fulfillment. However, familiarity quickly breeds indifference, and the initial passion fades into routine companionship. The person then faces a choice between accepting boring stability or seeking new romantic excitement elsewhere. Career ambition follows identical mechanics, but extends over longer time periods. The ambitious employee suffers through years of struggle, believing that promotion will bring satisfaction and security. They sacrifice personal relationships, health, and present enjoyment for future rewards. When promotion finally arrives, they experience momentary triumph before discovering that higher positions bring new stresses and responsibilities. The executive who once dreamed of corner offices now worries about quarterly results and board meetings. Success reveals itself as another form of entrapment rather than genuine liberation. Schopenhauer observed that wealthy individuals often suffer more acutely from boredom than poor people suffer from deprivation. Poverty creates constant pressure to meet basic needs, providing clear goals and immediate purposes. Wealth eliminates these natural motivations, leaving consciousness without obvious directions for its energy. The rich person faces the existential question of what to do with unlimited options, and discovers that freedom without necessity feels empty. They pursue increasingly exotic pleasures and elaborate diversions to escape the void created by satisfied desires. This explains why luxury resorts, expensive hobbies, and exclusive experiences often fail to produce lasting contentment among affluent individuals. The pendulum operates across all time scales, from momentary fluctuations to life-spanning patterns. Within a single day, people cycle between minor wants and brief satisfactions dozens of times. They feel thirsty, drink water, and immediately begin thinking about their next meal. They complete one task and automatically search for another source of stimulation. Over months and years, the same mechanism drives major life decisions and long-term planning. People change jobs, move to new cities, and alter their lifestyles in pursuit of satisfaction that remains perpetually elusive. Modern psychology confirms this pattern through research on hedonic adaptation and the hedonic treadmill. Studies demonstrate that people quickly return to baseline happiness levels after both positive and negative life events. Lottery winners report only temporary increases in life satisfaction before adapting to their new circumstances. Similarly, individuals who suffer major setbacks often return to previous happiness levels within months or years. This research validates Schopenhauer's observation that external changes provide only temporary modifications to underlying psychological states. The pendulum continues swinging regardless of circumstances, driven by internal mechanisms rather than external conditions. Part 3. The hierarchy of needs and their infinite expansion. Schopenhauer recognized that human needs arrange themselves in a cruel hierarchy, where satisfying lower levels only reveals higher levels of want. Basic biological requirements like food, shelter, and safety create immediate suffering when unmet. However, fulfilling these fundamental needs does not eliminate suffering, but merely transforms it into more sophisticated psychological forms. Each level of satisfaction unveils previously hidden layers of dissatisfaction, creating an endless escalation of desires. The progression begins with survival needs that command absolute priority when threatened. The starving person thinks only of food, believing that hunger represents their primary problem. Once adequately fed, they discover needs for better food, more variety and social dining experiences. What began as simple nutrition evolves into complex preferences about cuisine, presentation and dining atmosphere. The satisfied stomach generates new forms of dissatisfaction related to taste, status and social connection through food. The original problem disappears but spawns multiple replacement problems that prove equally demanding. Housing follows the same expanding pattern with mechanical precision. The homeless person focuses intensely on finding basic shelter from weather and danger. Securing minimal housing brings temporary relief before revealing needs for better neighborhoods, larger spaces, and improved amenities. The apartment dweller begins wanting a house with a yard. The homeowner decides they need a bigger house in a better school district. Each improvement satisfies the previous want while creating awareness of new deficiencies that demand attention and resources. Social needs demonstrate this escalation most clearly because they involve comparison with others. The lonely person desperately seeks any form of human connection and friendship. Forming basic social relationships provides relief until they begin comparing their social circle with others. They notice friends who seem more popular, attractive, or successful, and develop new forms of social anxiety. Simple companionship evolves into complex needs for status, admiration, and social dominance. The person who once felt grateful for any friendship now suffers because their friends are not prestigious enough. Romantic relationships exhibit particularly dramatic need escalation because they combine physical, emotional, and social elements. The single person believes that finding any romantic partner will solve their emotional problems. Early relationships do provide intense satisfaction, until familiarity reduces novelty and passion. The person then develops needs for a more attractive, intelligent or compatible partner. Marriage satisfies the need for commitment, but creates new pressures about lifestyle compatibility and family planning. Each stage of romantic development resolves previous anxieties while introducing previously unimaginable sources of stress and dissatisfaction. Career advancement creates especially vivid examples of need escalation because professional hierarchies make comparisons explicit. The unemployed person suffers from lack of income and social purpose, believing any job will provide satisfaction. Entry-level employment does relieve immediate financial pressure but reveals new needs for advancement and recognition. Each promotion satisfies the previous level of ambition while exposing higher levels of organizational hierarchy and competition. The manager, who once felt grateful for steady employment, now suffers because colleagues received better promotions or assignments. The executive who achieved their original career dreams discovers new anxieties about market competition and shareholder expectations. Intellectual and creative pursuits follow identical patterns despite their apparent nobility and higher purpose. The uneducated person believes that knowledge will bring enlightenment and satisfaction. Education does expand understanding, but reveals the vastness of ignorance and the complexity of previously unknown problems. Each level of learning creates awareness of higher levels of expertise and more sophisticated questions. The student who once struggled with basic concepts eventually suffers because their research is not groundbreaking enough for recognition. Knowledge transforms from solution into source of new forms of inadequacy and professional anxiety. This escalation occurs because the will uses satisfaction as bait to lure consciousness toward ever greater efforts on its behalf. Each fulfilled desire provides enough pleasure to maintain hope while simultaneously raising standards for future satisfaction. The mechanism ensures that individuals never stop striving, regardless of their objective circumstances or achievements. Billionaires continue accumulating wealth with the same intensity as people pursuing their first steady job. Nobel laureates suffer from professional insecurity as acutely as graduate students writing their first papers. The hierarchy of needs reveals itself as an infinite escalator rather than a staircase with a top floor. Part 4. Time consciousness and the multiplication of suffering. Human consciousness exists uniquely across multiple time dimensions, transforming temporary pain into permanent psychological torment. While animals suffer only in the present moment, humans carry past traumas forward and project future anxieties backward. This temporal awareness multiplies suffering exponentially by allowing single events to create lasting psychological damage. Memory and anticipation become instruments of torture that operate continuously, regardless of present circumstances. Consider how a brief physical injury creates extended psychological suffering through temporal consciousness. The animal that injures its leg experiences pain only while the wound heals, then returns to normal behavior. The human with the same injury relives the trauma repeatedly through memory, worries about permanent damage, and develops anxiety about future injuries. A momentary accident becomes a lifelong source of fear and regret that influences countless subsequent decisions. The original pain ends quickly, but its psychological reverberations continue for decades. Time consciousness transforms acute suffering into chronic psychological conditions that may never fully heal. Regret represents one of the most distinctive forms of human suffering because it exists entirely in consciousness rather than objective reality. People torture themselves over past decisions that cannot be changed or undone. The student who chose the wrong major continues suffering years after graduation, imagining how different their life might have been. The person who rejected a romantic opportunity replays the scenario endlessly, creating elaborate fantasies about alternative futures. These mental rehearsals of past mistakes serve no practical purpose but generate real psychological pain. Consciousness creates suffering from events that exist only in memory, demonstrating its power to manufacture misery from nothing. Anticipatory anxiety operates through similar mechanisms but focuses on imagined future threats rather than past mistakes. People suffer intensely from events that may never occur, creating elaborate scenarios of potential disaster. The parent whose child is 5 minutes late from school immediately imagines accidents, kidnapping, or medical emergencies. The employee called to an unexpected meeting assumes they are about to be fired and experiences genuine distress over imaginary unemployment. These anticipatory sufferings often prove completely unfounded, but consciousness generates real pain from purely hypothetical situations. The capacity to preview potential futures becomes a source of continuous psychological torment. Financial anxiety demonstrates how temporal consciousness creates suffering that transcends actual economic conditions. The person with adequate savings suffers from imagining future poverty or economic collapse. They calculate how long their money will last under various catastrophic scenarios, creating detailed plans for disasters that will likely never occur. Meanwhile, their present financial security provides no psychological relief because consciousness remains focused on potential future problems. The anxiety exists entirely in temporal projection rather than current reality, but it influences behavior and decisions as powerfully as actual financial crisis. Time consciousness transforms adequate resources into sources of perpetual worry about inadequate future resources. Aging creates uniquely human forms of suffering because it involves consciousness of temporal progression and inevitable decline. Animals experience the physical effects of aging without psychological torment about the process. Humans begin fearing old age in their 20s, spending decades anticipating decline, disability and death. Each birthday becomes a reminder of lost time and approaching mortality rather than an occasion for celebration. The middle-aged person suffers not from present physical limitations, but from awareness that their capabilities will continue deteriorating. This knowledge transforms the natural process of aging into a prolonged psychological ordeal that begins long before actual physical decline. Comparison across time creates additional layers of suffering unique to creatures with extended memory and projection capabilities. People compare their present situation not only with others, but with their own past selves and imagined future selves. The successful professional suffers because they are not as innovative as they were 10 years ago. The athlete experiences depression not from poor current performance, but from comparison with their peak abilities. These temporal comparisons create forms of inadequacy that exist entirely within consciousness rather than external circumstances. The person becomes their own worst critic by maintaining impossible standards based on selective memories and unrealistic projections. Modern neuroscience reveals that human brains are indeed uniquely structured to process temporal information and create mental time travel. The prefrontal cortex enables complex planning and memory integration that other species cannot achieve. However, these same neural capabilities that enable human achievement also create vulnerability to distinctly human forms of psychological suffering. Brain imaging studies show that people with depression and anxiety disorders exhibit hyperactivity in regions associated with temporal processing and self-referential thinking. This research confirms Schopenhauer's insight that advanced consciousness, while enabling human civilization, also creates unprecedented possibilities for psychological torment. The price of temporal awareness is the transformation of temporary pain into permanent psychological conditions that can persist long after their original causes have disappeared. Part 5. Competition and the social multiplication of suffering. Human suffering intensifies dramatically through social comparison and competition because the will manifests not just in individuals but in the relationships between them. Every person becomes both subject and object of striving, creating complex webs of mutual frustration and conflict. Social existence transforms private suffering into public performance, where individuals must not only manage their own pain, but also compete for resources, status, and recognition. This social dimension multiplies individual suffering exponentially while creating entirely new categories of psychological torment. Status anxiety represents one of the most pervasive forms of socially generated suffering because it makes every interaction a potential source of humiliation or validation. People constantly evaluate their position relative to others, transforming neutral situations into competitions with winners and losers. The professional at a conference suffers not from their actual job performance, but from comparing their achievements with more successful colleagues. The homeowner feels inadequate not because their house lacks necessary features, but because neighbours have larger homes or better neighbourhoods. These comparisons create suffering where none would exist in isolation, demonstrating how social consciousness manufactures misery from relative rather than absolute conditions. Individual worth becomes dependent on external validation and competitive positioning rather than intrinsic satisfaction or objective capabilities. Romantic competition creates particularly intense suffering because it combines biological drives with social humiliation. The person whose romantic interest chooses someone else experiences rejection not just as personal disappointment, but as public demonstration of their inadequacy. They begin comparing themselves obsessively with the successful rival, identifying every way in which they fall short. Physical appearance, personality traits, career success and social skills become sources of painful self-criticism. The original romantic desire transforms into complex feelings of jealousy, resentment, and self-hatred that persist long after the specific situation ends. Social rejection in romantic contexts creates lasting damage to self-esteem and confidence that affects future relationships and general psychological well-being. Professional competition generates chronic stress because career advancement requires continuous comparison with colleagues and rivals. The workplace becomes a battlefield where individuals must simultaneously cooperate and compete with the same people. Every meeting, project and interaction contains elements of performance evaluation and competitive positioning. Colleagues become potential threats whose success diminishes one's own prospects for advancement or recognition. This creates paranoid psychological states where genuine friendship becomes impossible, and every professional relationship contains elements of strategic calculation. The person spends more energy managing competitive dynamics than focusing on actual work, transforming productive activity into elaborate social games with unclear rules and changing objectives. Social media has amplified these competitive dynamics by making previously private achievements and failures visible to extended networks. People now compete not just with immediate colleagues and neighbours, but with hundreds of acquaintances and strangers. The curated presentations of others' lives create impossible standards for happiness, success, and lifestyle quality. Individuals suffer from comparing their internal experience with others' external presentations, not recognizing the fundamental inequality of this comparison. The parent feels inadequate because other families post photos of elaborate vacations and achievements while hiding their struggles and conflicts. This constant exposure to others' apparent success creates chronic feelings of inadequacy and missing out that previous generations never experienced. Economic inequality creates systematic forms of social suffering because it makes competitive positioning visible through material possessions and lifestyle differences. The person with adequate income suffers when surrounded by others with significantly more wealth and luxury. Their objective standard of living provides no psychological satisfaction because consciousness focuses on relative rather than absolute conditions. The middle-class family feels poor when exposed to upper-class neighborhoods and lifestyles. These comparisons create genuine distress and motivate destructive behaviors like excessive debt and overwork in pursuit of competitive material positioning. Economic systems based on competition and inequality ensure that most people will always fall short of someone else's standard, creating permanent dissatisfaction regardless of absolute living conditions. Educational systems intensify competitive suffering by ranking students explicitly and creating hierarchies of achievement that follow individuals throughout their lives. Children learn to measure their worth through grades, test scores, and admission to prestigious institutions. The student who receives a B grade suffers not from inadequate learning, but from comparison with A students who achieved higher rankings. These early competitive experiences create lasting patterns of self-evaluation based on external validation rather than intrinsic satisfaction with learning and growth. Adults continue suffering from educational comparisons decades after leaving school, defining themselves through institutions they attended rather than capabilities they developed or contributions they made. The competitive educational structure transforms learning from natural curiosity into a source of anxiety, shame, and inadequacy that affects lifelong psychological development. Schopenhauer recognized that social competition represents the will using individuals against each other to maximize its own expression through conflict and struggle. Each person becomes an obstacle to others' satisfaction, while simultaneously depending on others for validation and recognition. This creates inherently unstable psychological conditions where genuine peace becomes impossible as long as individuals define themselves through competitive positioning. The social multiplication of suffering serves the will's purposes by ensuring that no one ever achieves lasting satisfaction that might reduce their striving and competitive effort. Competition keeps consciousness focused outward on defeating others, rather than inward on understanding the mechanisms that create suffering in the first place. Social dynamics become elaborate distractions that prevent individuals from recognizing their true situation and seeking genuine liberation from the competitive cycle. Part 6. The body as prison of consciousness. The human body represents the most immediate and inescapable source of suffering because consciousness finds itself trapped within a physical form, subject to pain, illness, aging, and death. Unlike abstract psychological suffering, bodily pain demands immediate attention and cannot be ignored through mental effort or philosophical understanding. The body operates according to biological imperatives that consciousness cannot control, creating a fundamental conflict between mental desires and physical limitations. This imprisonment in flesh ensures that even the most enlightened individuals remain vulnerable to forms of suffering that transcend intellectual solutions. Physical pain creates suffering that exists prior to any interpretation or meaning-making by consciousness. The person with a severe headache cannot think their way out of discomfort or reframe the experience through positive psychology. The pain simply exists as raw sensory input that overwhelms other mental processes. This demonstrates that suffering has biological roots that persist regardless of philosophical sophistication or spiritual development. The body imposes its own agenda on consciousness, interrupting plans, desires, and activities according to its own rhythms and vulnerabilities. Even brief illnesses can derail months of psychological progress and reduce complex individuals to basic biological needs and limitations. Chronic illness reveals how bodily suffering creates cascading psychological effects that transform entire life structures. The person diagnosed with a serious medical condition experiences not just physical symptoms, but complete reorganization of their identity and possibilities. Career plans become irrelevant when energy levels cannot support full-time work. Relationship dynamics change when one partner requires constant care and support. Future goals must be abandoned or modified based on realistic assessments of declining physical capabilities. The chronic illness becomes a lens through which every decision must be filtered, transforming previously automatic choices into complex calculations about energy, risk, and physical limitations. Aging represents the most universal form of bodily imprisonment because it affects every person regardless of their mental achievements or spiritual development. The aging process imposes increasing limitations that consciousness cannot overcome through effort or willpower. The athlete who once ran marathons must accept that their body no longer supports such activities. The intellectual who prided themselves on mental sharpness must acknowledge declining memory and processing speed. These physical changes occur independently of the person's desires or self-image, creating inevitable conflicts between mental identity and bodily reality. The aging body becomes a constant reminder of mortality and limitations that no amount of positive thinking can eliminate. Sexual desire demonstrates how the body can hijack consciousness for its own biological purposes, despite rational objections. People find themselves attracted to individuals who are logically unsuitable as partners or who represent threats to their existing relationships and commitments. The married person experiences unwanted sexual attraction that conflicts with their values and intentions. The professional risks their career for sexual encounters that provide no lasting satisfaction but create enormous complications. These experiences reveal how bodily drives can override conscious decision-making and create behaviors that the person later regrets but cannot easily control. Sexual desire operates through biochemical processes that consciousness experiences but cannot directly modify through rational reflection or moral commitment. Sleep requirements impose daily limitations that interrupt consciousness and remind it of its dependence on bodily processes. The person cannot simply decide to remain awake indefinitely when important projects demand attention. Sleep deprivation creates cognitive impairment, emotional instability, and physical discomfort that affect every aspect of experience. Dreams intrude into sleep with content that consciousness did not choose and often cannot remember or understand. The daily cycle of sleep and waking creates temporal gaps in conscious experience that highlight the fragility and dependence of mental life on biological processes. Even this most basic bodily requirement can become a source of frustration when consciousness desires to remain active but physiology demands rest. Addiction reveals the most dramatic examples of bodily imprisonment because substances can override conscious intentions and create compulsive behaviors that the person knows are destructive. The alcoholic understands intellectually that drinking causes problems but cannot consistently resist the biological craving for alcohol. The drug addict experiences physical withdrawal symptoms that create suffering intense enough to motivate behaviors they morally oppose. These conditions demonstrate how chemical changes in the body can fundamentally alter consciousness and decision-making capabilities. The addicted person becomes a prisoner of their own biochemistry, watching themselves engage in self-destructive behaviors while feeling powerless to consistently choose different actions. Addiction illustrates the ultimate victory of body over mind, where physical processes determine behavior despite clear mental understanding of consequences. Schopenhauer recognized that embodied existence ensures that consciousness can never achieve complete freedom from suffering, because it remains dependent on biological processes that operate according to their own imperatives. The body represents the will's most direct method of controlling consciousness by creating needs, desires, and limitations that cannot be eliminated through mental effort alone. Physical pain serves as an immediate correction mechanism that redirects attention from abstract concerns to biological survival. The body's vulnerability to injury, illness and death creates constant background anxiety that influences all decision-making and planning. This biological foundation of suffering ensures that even the most sophisticated philosophical insights cannot provide complete liberation from the human condition. The prison of flesh represents an inescapable constraint that affects saints and philosophers as much as ordinary individuals focused on material concerns. Part 7. The illusion of progress and lasting achievement. Human consciousness creates elaborate myths of progress and permanent achievement to mask the repetitive nature of desire and satisfaction. People believe that reaching certain goals will provide lasting fulfillment and end their struggle with dissatisfaction. This illusion motivates enormous effort and sacrifice in pursuit of achievements that ultimately prove as temporary and unsatisfying as smaller accomplishments. The mythology of progress serves the will by ensuring that individuals continue striving throughout their lives rather than recognizing the futility of seeking permanent satisfaction through external achievements. Career advancement provides the most systematic example of progress illusion, because professional hierarchies create clear markers of success and achievement. The entry-level employee believes that reaching management will provide security, respect, and satisfaction with their professional life. Promotion does bring temporary excitement and validation, but it also introduces new stresses, responsibilities, and competitive pressures. The manager discovers that their position requires longer hours, more difficult decisions, and greater accountability for outcomes beyond their direct control. Rather than providing the anticipated relief from workplace frustration, advancement typically increases both the complexity and intensity of professional challenges. Each level of success reveals new forms of inadequacy and exposes higher levels of organizational hierarchy that must be conquered. Educational achievement follows similar patterns of promised fulfillment, followed by renewed striving and dissatisfaction. The high school student believes that college admission will validate their intelligence and open doors to a satisfying career. College does provide new opportunities, but also introduces academic competition, financial pressure, and uncertainty about future direction. The undergraduate then focuses on graduate school admission as the key to professional success and intellectual fulfillment. Graduate education brings its own forms of stress, including research pressure, teaching responsibilities, and competitive job markets. The PhD recipient discovers that academic careers involve endless grant applications, publication pressure, and institutional politics, rather than the pure intellectual inquiry they originally sought. Wealth accumulation represents perhaps the most obvious example of how achievement fails to provide lasting satisfaction despite popular beliefs about money-solving life problems. The person earning minimum wage naturally believes that doubling their income will eliminate financial stress and provide security. Higher income does relieve immediate financial pressure, but typically leads to lifestyle inflation and new categories of expenses. The person who once struggled to pay rent begins worrying about mortgage payments, property taxes, and home maintenance costs. Each level of wealth creates awareness of higher levels of affluence and introduces new forms of financial anxiety about market volatility, investment performance, and estate planning. Studies of lottery winners confirm that sudden wealth provides only temporary increases in happiness before people adapt to their new circumstances and return to previous satisfaction levels. Romantic achievement demonstrates how even the most intimate and personally meaningful accomplishments fail to provide permanent fulfillment. The lonely person believes that finding true love will solve their emotional problems and provide lasting happiness. Falling in love does create intense joy and satisfaction, but romantic relationships inevitably encounter conflicts, routine, and the challenges of daily coexistence. The initial passion fades as partners become familiar with each other's habits, preferences, and limitations. Marriage introduces new pressures, including financial coordination, family obligations, and decisions about children and lifestyle. Rather than ending the search for romantic fulfillment, successful relationships often reveal how much work is required to maintain emotional connection and mutual satisfaction over time. Physical fitness and appearance improvements illustrate how even personal development achievements fail to provide lasting psychological satisfaction. The overweight person believes that reaching their ideal weight will transform their self-image and social interactions. Weight loss does provide temporary confidence boost and improved health markers. However, maintaining weight loss requires continuous effort and vigilance that can become as stressful as the original weight problem. The person who achieves their fitness goals often discovers new forms of body dissatisfaction and comparison with others who appear more fit or attractive. Physical improvement becomes an ongoing project rather than a completed achievement, requiring constant maintenance and generating new forms of appearance-related anxiety. Creative achievement follows the same pattern despite its association with personal expression and intrinsic motivation. The aspiring artist believes that creating meaningful work and gaining recognition will provide deep satisfaction and validate their creative talents. Artistic success does bring fulfillment, but it also introduces commercial pressures, critical evaluation, and expectations for continued innovation. The successful artist must balance creative integrity with market demands while managing the anxiety of living up to their previous achievements. Recognition brings new forms of pressure, including public scrutiny, competitive comparison with other artists, and the challenge of maintaining relevance in changing cultural contexts. Even the most meaningful creative work becomes subject to external evaluation and commercial considerations that can undermine the intrinsic motivation that originally inspired artistic pursuit. Schopenhauer understood that the illusion of progress serves the will by maintaining hope and motivation despite repeated evidence that achievements provide only temporary satisfaction. Each accomplishment provides enough pleasure to validate the belief that the next achievement will bring lasting fulfillment. This creates a psychological trap where people continue pursuing external goals despite accumulated evidence that such pursuits do not produce permanent happiness. The mythology of progress prevents individuals from questioning whether the entire approach of seeking satisfaction through achievement might be fundamentally flawed. Instead of recognizing that external accomplishments cannot provide lasting peace, people assume they simply have not yet achieved the right goals or reached high enough levels of success. This keeps consciousness focused outward on future achievements rather than inward on understanding the mechanisms that create dissatisfaction regardless of external circumstances. Part 8. Intelligence as amplifier of suffering. Higher intelligence increases rather than decreases human suffering by providing greater awareness of life's problems, contradictions, and ultimate futility. While intellectual capacity enables technological progress and cultural achievement, it also creates forms of psychological torment unavailable to less reflective minds. The intelligent person sees through comfortable illusions that protect others from existential anxiety and recognizes patterns of meaninglessness that remain invisible to simpler consciousness. Knowledge becomes a burden rather than liberation when it reveals the extent of human insignificance and the impossibility of finding ultimate purpose or meaning. Intellectual awareness of mortality creates uniquely human forms of death anxiety that affect every aspect of life planning and decision-making. While animals fear immediate threats to survival, they lack the cognitive capacity to contemplate their inevitable death years or decades in advance. Humans begin fearing death in childhood and spend their entire lives managing anxiety about their ultimate fate. This awareness transforms every achievement into a temporary distraction from the fundamental fact of human finitude. The intelligent person recognizes that death will eventually render all their accomplishments meaningless, creating existential depression that simpler minds avoid through limited temporal awareness. Knowledge of mortality becomes a constant source of background anxiety that influences career choices, relationships, and daily activities. Scientific understanding reveals the universe's vastness and humanity's cosmic insignificance in ways that can be psychologically devastating. The educated person knows that Earth represents a tiny speck in an incomprehensibly large universe that shows no evidence of caring about human concerns or survival. This knowledge makes human problems seem trivial, while simultaneously making them feel more overwhelming because they cannot be resolved through appeal to higher meaning or purpose. The person who understands evolutionary biology recognizes that human consciousness arose through blind natural processes without inherent purpose or direction. Rather than providing comfort through understanding, scientific knowledge often increases anxiety by revealing the absence of cosmic meaning or divine plan that might justify human suffering. Intelligence exposes the uncomfortable truth that humans must create their own meaning in a universe that provides no inherent significance for their existence. Historical knowledge creates additional psychological burdens by revealing the repetitive nature of human problems and the failure of previous generations to solve fundamental issues. The educated person recognizes that war, poverty, injustice and suffering have persisted throughout recorded history despite countless reform efforts and technological advances. This awareness makes current social problems seem simultaneously urgent and hopeless, creating political depression and cynicism. Knowledge of past civilizations that rose and fell demonstrates the temporary nature of all human institutions and achievements. The intelligent person cannot maintain naive optimism about social progress when historical evidence suggests that human nature remains fundamentally unchanged despite external improvements in living conditions and technology. Historical awareness transforms current events from meaningful developments into repetitive cycles of familiar human failures and limitations. Psychological insight creates suffering by revealing the unconscious motivations and self-deceptions that govern human behavior. The person who understands psychology recognizes their own defense mechanisms, cognitive biases, and emotional manipulations. This self-awareness can be paralyzing because it undermines the automatic responses and comfortable assumptions that enable most people to navigate social situations without excessive self-consciousness. Knowledge of psychological principles reveals how much human behavior stems from unconscious drives rather than rational choices. The psychologically sophisticated person becomes overly analytical about their own motivations and those of others, transforming natural interactions into complex exercises in psychological interpretation. Understanding human psychology can reduce empathy and spontaneity by exposing the mechanical nature of emotional responses and social behaviors. Philosophical education introduces questions about meaning, purpose, and value that cannot be definitively answered but continue demanding attention once raised. The person who studies philosophy becomes aware of fundamental disagreements about ethics, reality, and human nature that have persisted for thousands of years without resolution. This knowledge undermines certainty about moral choices and life direction while providing no clear alternatives to replace abandoned beliefs. Philosophical sophistication often leads to paralysis and indecision because every choice can be questioned from multiple theoretical perspectives. The educated person struggles with relativism and nihilism that naturally arise from exposure to competing world views and value systems. Rather than providing wisdom and guidance, philosophical knowledge often increases anxiety and confusion about how to live and what to value. Economic and political understanding reveals the extent of systemic problems that individuals cannot solve through personal effort or good intentions. The intelligent person recognizes how inequality, corruption, and environmental destruction result from structural features of economic and political systems rather than individual moral failures. This awareness creates feelings of helplessness and guilt about participating in systems that cause harm while providing no clear alternatives for individual action. Knowledge of global problems like climate change and resource depletion generates anxiety about humanity's future that affects personal planning and psychological well-being. The educated person cannot maintain comfortable ignorance about systemic injustices, but also cannot take effective action to address problems that require collective solutions beyond individual capacity. Intelligence creates moral burden by making people aware of their complicity in harmful systems without providing practical methods for meaningful resistance or alternative participation. Schopenhauer observed that genius and high intelligence correlate with melancholy and depression precisely because intellectual capacity provides clearer vision into the nature of existence and human condition. The most intelligent individuals see through the illusions and distractions that protect others from existential despair. They recognize patterns of futility and meaninglessness that remain invisible to minds focused on immediate concerns and simple pleasures. This creates the paradox that intellectual development, while enabling cultural progress and scientific advancement, also increases individual suffering through expanded awareness of life's fundamental problems. Intelligence serves the will by enabling more sophisticated forms of striving and achievement, but it punishes individuals by revealing the ultimate futility of their efforts and the absence of cosmic meaning that might justify their struggles. The price of intellectual sophistication is the loss of comfortable ignorance and simple faith that enable less reflective minds to maintain optimism despite obvious evidence of life's difficulties and ultimate meaninglessness. Part 9. The Mathematics of Pleasure and Pain. Schopenhauer discovered that pleasure and pain operate according to asymmetrical principles that ensure suffering dominates human experience despite occasional moments of satisfaction. This psychological mathematics reveals why negative experiences affect consciousness more powerfully than positive ones, and why people consistently underestimate how much they will suffer while overestimating how much they will enjoy future pleasures. Understanding these quantitative relationships explains why external improvements in living conditions often fail to produce proportional increases in happiness and life satisfaction. The mathematical structure of human emotions serves the will by ensuring that consciousness remains motivated to continue striving regardless of circumstances or achievements. The fundamental asymmetry lies in the relationship between presence and absence of satisfaction. Pain exists as a positive force that actively asserts itself in consciousness and demands immediate attention and response. Pleasure exists merely as the temporary absence of pain, rather than an independent positive state with its own substance and duration. This means that suffering has concrete reality, while happiness represents only relief from concrete problems. The hungry person experiences real distress that commands attention, while the satisfied person simply notices the absence of hunger without experiencing active pleasure. This asymmetry ensures that problems feel more urgent and compelling than solutions, keeping consciousness focused on addressing deficiencies rather than enjoying adequacy. Duration patterns reveal another mathematical principle that favors suffering over satisfaction, in the overall calculation of human experience. Painful experiences tend to persist and demand sustained attention until they are resolved or become unbearable. The person with a toothache cannot ignore the pain or focus effectively on other activities until the dental problem receives treatment. Pleasant experiences fade quickly through habituation and lose their capacity to generate continued satisfaction. The person eating a delicious meal experiences peak pleasure only during the first few bites before taste receptors adapt and reduce sensitivity. This temporal asymmetry means that negative experiences accumulate over time, while positive experiences dissipate rapidly, creating an overall balance that favors suffering in the psychological accounting of life satisfaction. Intensity relationships demonstrate that negative experiences typically register more powerfully in consciousness than equivalent positive experiences. The pain of losing $100 affects most people more severely than the pleasure of finding $100. A single harsh criticism can overshadow dozens of compliments and praise. One embarrassing social mistake can undermine years of successful social interactions and reputation building. This intensity bias ensures that consciousness pays disproportionate attention to threats and problems while taking benefits and successes for granted. The mathematical weighting of experience favors negative events in memory formation and decision-making, creating chronic anxiety and pessimistic expectations that affect behavior and life choices. Adaptation rates reveal that consciousness adjusts more completely and permanently to positive changes than negative ones. People adapt relatively quickly to improvements in income, housing, and social status, returning to baseline happiness levels within months or years. However, they adapt more slowly and incompletely to negative changes like disability, unemployment, or loss of loved ones. This asymmetrical adaptation ensures that positive achievements provide only temporary boosts to life satisfaction, while negative events create lasting decreases in well-being. The person who receives a promotion experiences brief excitement before adapting to their new circumstances and taking improved conditions for granted. The person who suffers a serious injury may never fully adapt to their limitations and continues experiencing reduced life satisfaction years after the initial trauma. Frequency effects show that consciousness becomes more sensitive to repeated negative experiences, while becoming less responsive to repeated positive experiences. The worker who receives daily criticism becomes increasingly demoralized and anxious, even if the criticism contains valid feedback for improvement. The worker who receives daily praise quickly adapts to positive feedback and requires increasingly elaborate recognition to maintain motivation and satisfaction. This frequency asymmetry means that negative environments create cumulative psychological damage, while positive environments provide diminishing returns over time. Relationships characterized by occasional conflict tend to deteriorate because negative interactions have cumulative effects that outweigh more frequent positive interactions. The mathematical structure of emotional response makes it easier to destroy satisfaction than to build and maintain it through consistent positive experiences. Memory formation follows patterns that preferentially encode and retrieve negative experiences over positive ones. People remember traumatic events in vivid detail years after they occur, while forgetting pleasant experiences that seemed significant at the time. This memorial bias ensures that consciousness maintains detailed records of threats and failures, while losing access to experiences of satisfaction and success. The selective encoding of negative experiences creates pessimistic worldviews based on incomplete data that overrepresents problems and underrepresents solutions. Memory becomes a repository of evidence for life's difficulty and danger, rather than a resource for optimism and confidence about future possibilities. This psychological mathematics serves evolutionary purposes by maintaining vigilance for threats, but it also ensures that consciousness experiences life as more difficult and dangerous than objective circumstances warrant. Comparison mechanisms reveal that satisfaction depends more on relative positioning than absolute conditions, creating mathematical relationships that make contentment inherently unstable. The person earning $50,000 feels poor when surrounded by people earning $100,000, but feels wealthy when surrounded by people earning $20,000. This means that happiness calculations depend on social context rather than objective standards, making satisfaction vulnerable to changes in comparison groups. Social mobility and media exposure constantly alter reference points for comparison, creating moving targets for life satisfaction that can never be permanently achieved. The mathematical structure of social comparison ensures that most people will always fall short of someone else's standard, while rarely feeling grateful for advantages over those with less favourable circumstances. Relative positioning creates zero-sum psychological dynamics, where one person's advancement necessarily threatens others' satisfaction, multiplying individual suffering through competitive social relationships. Schopenhauer recognized that these mathematical principles governing pleasure and pain serve the will by ensuring that consciousness never achieves lasting satisfaction that might reduce motivation and striving. The asymmetrical structure of human emotion keeps individuals focused on solving problems and pursuing improvements rather than enjoying current conditions. This psychological mathematics explains why technological progress and increased prosperity often fail to produce corresponding increases in happiness and life satisfaction at individual or societal levels. Understanding these quantitative relationships reveals why efforts to improve well-being through external changes typically provide only temporary benefits before consciousness returns to its default state of dissatisfaction and continued striving. The mathematical structure of human experience ensures that suffering maintains its dominance regardless of objective improvements in living conditions or personal circumstances. This represents the will's most sophisticated mechanism for ensuring that consciousness remains enslaved to endless cycles of desire and frustration that serve biological and evolutionary purposes rather than individual happiness and fulfillment. Part 10. Death anxiety as the foundation of all human suffering. The knowledge of inevitable death underlies every form of human suffering because consciousness must construct meaning and pursue goals while knowing that all efforts will ultimately be terminated by mortality. This creates a fundamental existential contradiction that affects every aspect of human experience and decision-making. Death anxiety operates as background radiation that influences behavior even when not consciously recognized, driving people toward desperate attempts to create permanence and significance in a temporary existence. The awareness of mortality transforms every achievement into a race against time and every relationship into a temporary arrangement that death will inevitably dissolve. Death anxiety begins in childhood, when developing intelligence first grasps the concept of personal mortality. The child who learns that all living things eventually die experiences existential terror that no amount of adult reassurance can completely eliminate. This early confrontation with mortality creates defense mechanisms and psychological patterns that persist throughout life. Children begin constructing fantasies of immortality through religion, heroism, or special significance to manage the overwhelming reality of their finite existence. These childhood defenses against death anxiety shape adult personality development and influence career choices, relationship patterns and life goals in ways that remain largely unconscious. The foundation of character structure rests on strategies for managing terror about personal extinction that consciousness cannot fully acknowledge without risking psychological paralysis. Career ambition often represents disguised attempts to achieve symbolic immortality through lasting achievements and social recognition. The professional who sacrifices personal relationships and health for career advancement unconsciously hopes that their work will outlast their biological existence. Scientists pursue discoveries that will bear their names in textbooks and research papers. Business leaders build companies and institutions that might survive their deaths. Artists create works that could influence future generations long after the creator has disappeared. These pursuits provide psychological defense against mortality by creating the illusion that some aspect of the person will persist beyond physical death through their contributions to human knowledge, culture, or economic activity. Parenting represents perhaps the most fundamental biological response to death anxiety through genetic continuation and psychological legacy. The overwhelming drive to reproduce and raise children serves death denial by ensuring that something of the person survives their individual extinction. Parents invest enormous energy and resources in their offspring partly because children represent their best chance at achieving a form of immortality. The intensity of parental love and protection reflects unconscious recognition that children carry forward genetic material and psychological influence that would otherwise disappear with the parent's death. Parenting decisions become laden with significance because they determine how much of the parent's identity and values will persist beyond their lifetime. The empty nest syndrome and difficulty letting adult children make independent choices reflect parental anxiety about losing their primary vehicle for symbolic immortality. Religious belief systems provide the most direct attempts to resolve death anxiety by promising literal continuation of consciousness beyond physical death. Beliefs in heaven, reincarnation, or spiritual transcendence offer hope that mortality represents transition rather than extinction. These belief systems often require significant sacrifice of rational thinking and evidence-based reasoning to maintain faith in unprovable propositions about post-mortem existence. The psychological comfort provided by religious immortality beliefs can be so powerful that people willingly suppress doubt and critical thinking to preserve hope about survival after death. Religious conversion often occurs during periods of heightened death anxiety, such as serious illness, loss of loved ones, or advancing age when mortality becomes more salient and threatening. The intensity of religious commitment frequently correlates with the strength of underlying death anxiety and the person's need for immortality reassurance. Romantic love provides temporary escape from death anxiety through psychological fusion with another person that creates illusions of transcendence and permanence. The lover experiences moments of ego dissolution where individual boundaries seem to disappear and consciousness merges with the beloved. These experiences of union provide relief from the isolation and vulnerability that death anxiety creates. Romantic relationships also offer hope for symbolic immortality through shared legacy, children, and mutual influence on each other's development. However, romantic love also amplifies death anxiety by creating additional sources of loss and vulnerability through emotional dependence on another mortal being. The fear of losing the beloved through death or abandonment can intensify rather than reduce existential anxiety about impermanence and separation. Accumulation of wealth and possessions represents attempts to build barriers against mortality through material security and control over environmental threats. Money provides illusions of protection from the dangers and uncertainties that make death feel more immediate and probable. Wealthy individuals can afford better healthcare, safer living conditions, and more comfortable circumstances that seem to offer some defense against mortality. However, wealth accumulation also creates new forms of death anxiety because possessions and financial assets cannot be carried beyond death. The wealthy person faces the existential challenge of accepting that their accumulated resources will be distributed to others while they cease to exist entirely. Estate planning becomes a painful reminder of mortality that forces confrontation with the reality that wealth provides only temporary and partial protection against the ultimate threat of personal extinction. Schopenhauer understood that death anxiety drives the will's manipulation of consciousness by creating urgency and desperation that prevent calm reflection on the nature of existence. The knowledge of mortality makes every desire feel urgent and every delay feel threatening because time is limited and running out. This temporal pressure keeps consciousness focused on achieving goals and solving problems, rather than questioning whether such activities provide genuine satisfaction or serve the person's deepest interests. Death anxiety ensures that people remain trapped in cycles of striving and achievement, because stopping to reflect on life's meaning would require confronting the terror of personal extinction. The will uses mortality as the ultimate motivation for continued effort and engagement with life, despite repeated evidence that such efforts provide only temporary satisfaction. Only by recognizing and accepting the reality of death can consciousness begin to free itself from the desperate striving that mortality creates. But such acceptance requires confronting existential terror that most people cannot tolerate without elaborate psychological defenses and distractions. Part 11. Hope as the engine of perpetual suffering. Hope represents one of the most psychologically devastating forces in human experience because it maintains the illusion that future satisfaction will compensate for present dissatisfaction. While hope appears to provide comfort and motivation during difficult periods, it actually serves the will by preventing individuals from accepting their current situation and seeking genuine liberation from the cycle of desire. Hope keeps consciousness focused on imaginary future states, rather than understanding present reality, creating a temporal prison that extends suffering indefinitely through false promises of eventual fulfillment. The person trapped by hope continues investing energy in pursuits that cannot provide lasting satisfaction, while remaining blind to the mechanisms that create their dissatisfaction in the first place. Hope operates through selective attention that emphasizes potential positive outcomes while minimizing evidence of probable disappointment. The lottery player focuses intensely on the tiny probability of winning millions, while ignoring the mathematical certainty that they will lose their investment. The aspiring actor concentrates on stories of successful performers while overlooking the thousands of equally talented individuals who never achieve recognition or financial stability. This selective perception creates cognitive bubbles that protect hope from reality testing and rational evaluation. The hopeful person becomes psychologically invested in maintaining optimistic fantasies because acknowledging realistic probabilities would require confronting the futility of their current efforts and the need to fundamentally change their approach to satisfaction. Hope becomes a form of addiction that provides temporary emotional relief while preventing the honest assessment necessary for genuine problem-solving. Romantic hope demonstrates particularly clearly how future-oriented thinking creates present suffering while promising eventual relief. The person infatuated with someone who shows little interest continues believing that persistent effort will eventually win the desired response. They interpret neutral interactions as encouraging signs and dismiss clear rejections as temporary obstacles that persistence can overcome. This romantic hope creates months or years of anxiety, disappointment, and obsessive thinking focused on an increasingly unlikely outcome. The hopeful lover sacrifices opportunities for genuine connection with available partners while investing emotional energy in fantasy relationships that exist primarily in their imagination. When reality finally forces recognition that their hope was unfounded, they often transfer the same hopeful pattern to a new target, rather than questioning whether the entire approach to romance through hopeful pursuit might be fundamentally flawed. Career hope traps people in unsatisfying situations by promising that current sacrifices will eventually lead to meaningful work and financial security. The medical student endures years of grueling study and debt accumulation while hoping that becoming a doctor will provide the respect, income, and professional satisfaction that justify present hardships. The pre-medical student may hate their science courses and feel no genuine interest in healthcare, but hope for future status and security motivates continued effort, despite clear evidence of poor fit between their interests and their chosen path. When they finally enter medical practice, they often discover that the reality involves bureaucratic frustrations, legal liability, and emotional demands that they never anticipated during their years of hopeful preparation. Rather than acknowledging that their hope was based on incomplete information and unrealistic expectations, many professionals become trapped in careers they dislike, because abandoning their investment would require admitting that years of hopeful effort were misdirected. Career hope creates sunk cost fallacies that prevent rational evaluation of whether current paths serve genuine interests and values. Religious hope represents perhaps the most systematic example of how future-oriented thinking can dominate consciousness and prevent engagement with present reality. Believers endure present suffering and sacrifice immediate pleasures while hoping for eternal rewards in an afterlife that cannot be verified or experienced until after death. This hope can motivate extraordinary personal sacrifice and social cooperation, but it also prevents honest examination of whether religious beliefs accurately describe reality or serve individual psychological needs. Religious hope often requires suppressing doubt and critical thinking that might undermine faith in unprovable propositions about divine justice and post-mortem existence. The believer becomes psychologically invested in maintaining hope because acknowledging uncertainty about afterlife rewards would require confronting the possibility that their sacrifices serve no ultimate purpose and that present suffering lacks cosmic significance. Religious communities often reinforce hope through social pressure and mutual encouragement that makes individual doubt feel like betrayal of group solidarity and shared purpose. Political hope creates collective suffering by promising that social reform and governmental change will solve problems that may actually stem from fundamental features of human nature and social organization. Citizens invest enormous emotional energy in electoral campaigns, while hoping that their preferred candidates will implement policies that create more just and prosperous societies. When political leaders inevitably fail to deliver transformative change, supporters often transfer their hope to new candidates, rather than questioning whether the political process can address the deeper sources of social problems. Political hope prevents recognition that many societal issues stem from psychological and biological features of human behavior that cannot be resolved through legislation or institutional reform. The hopeful citizen remains trapped in cycles of electoral excitement and disappointment that distract attention from personal responsibility and local community action that might provide more realistic opportunities for meaningful improvement. Political hope serves existing power structures by channeling dissatisfaction towards symbolic participation in democratic processes rather than fundamental questioning of whether current social arrangements can ever provide genuine justice and prosperity for all participants. Technological hope represents a modern form of future-oriented thinking that promises eventual solutions to fundamental human problems through scientific advancement and innovation. People hope that medical research will eliminate aging, disease and death, while technology will solve environmental problems and provide unlimited prosperity through automation and artificial intelligence. These hopes distract attention from present lifestyle choices and consumption patterns that contribute to current problems while creating false confidence that future technological solutions will compensate for present irresponsibility. Technological hope often ignores how new technologies create unforeseen complications and ethical dilemmas that may outweigh their intended benefits. The person hoping for technological salvation avoids making difficult personal changes while waiting for innovations that may never materialize or may create new categories of problems that require additional technological solutions in an endless cycle of technological dependency. Technological hope serves consumer capitalism by maintaining confidence in perpetual growth and innovation while preventing recognition that many human problems stem from psychological and social factors that technology cannot address. Schopenhauer understood that hope serves the will by maintaining motivation and effort, despite repeated evidence that external achievements provide only temporary satisfaction. Hope prevents the honest assessment of results that might lead to questioning whether the entire approach of seeking satisfaction through external change serves genuine human interests. Each disappointment is explained as a temporary setback or inadequate effort rather than evidence that the hopeful approach itself might be fundamentally flawed. This keeps consciousness focused on future possibilities rather than present reality, preventing the direct examination of current experience that might reveal alternative approaches to satisfaction and meaning. Hope becomes a psychological prison that maintains the illusion of eventual escape, while actually ensuring continued captivity to cycles of desire and frustration that serve the will's purposes rather than individual happiness and fulfillment. Only by abandoning hope and accepting present reality can consciousness begin to explore genuine alternatives to the hopeful pursuit of external solutions to internal problems that characterizes most human suffering. Part 12. Memory as the Archive of Suffering. Human memory operates as a sophisticated torture device that preserves and amplifies painful experiences while allowing pleasant memories to fade into insignificance. This psychological mechanism ensures that consciousness maintains detailed records of threats, failures, and traumas that continue influencing behavior and emotional states long after their original causes have disappeared. Memory transforms temporary pain into permanent psychological conditions by creating mental libraries of suffering that can be accessed and re-experienced with vivid intensity years or decades after the original events. The capacity for detailed recollection, which enables human learning and culture, also condemns consciousness to repeatedly reliving its worst moments while losing access to experiences of satisfaction and joy. Traumatic memories demonstrate most clearly how consciousness becomes prisoner to its own capacity for detailed recollection and emotional reconstruction. The person who survives a serious accident continues experiencing the terror and pain through flashbacks, nightmares, and intrusive thoughts that can persist for years without diminishing in intensity. These memories are not simply intellectual recollections, but complete sensory and emotional reconstructions that recreate the original trauma with devastating psychological impact. The survivor finds themselves trapped in endless repetitions of their worst moments, unable to escape into present safety because memory drags them back into past danger with mechanical regularity. Trauma memories often become more vivid and detailed than the original experience because consciousness focuses intensely on threat-related information while encoding traumatic events in multiple sensory and emotional channels. This creates psychological time bombs that can explode into awareness through seemingly innocent triggers, transforming safe present environments into recreations of past danger and helplessness. Social humiliation creates particularly persistent memory patterns because shame and embarrassment involve self-concept damage that consciousness cannot easily repair or forget. The person who makes an embarrassing mistake in public continues reliving the moment of exposure and ridicule years after observers have forgotten the incident entirely. The memory of humiliation becomes more vivid and painful through repetitive mental rehearsal that amplifies rather than diminishes the original emotional impact. Each recollection adds new layers of self-criticism and regret that make the memory more rather than less distressing over time. Social humiliation memories often expand to include elaborate fantasies about how the situation could have been handled differently, creating additional suffering through imaginary scenarios of better outcomes that highlight the person's actual failure and inadequacy. These memories become psychological weapons that consciousness uses against itself, maintaining chronic shame and social anxiety that affect future interactions and decision-making in ways that perpetuate rather than resolve the original problem. Relationship betrayal creates memory patterns that poison consciousness's capacity for trust and intimacy in all subsequent relationships. The person whose romantic partner cheats or whose close friend betrays confidences continues reliving the moment of discovery and the subsequent emotional devastation. These memories become templates that consciousness applies to new relationships, searching for signs of potential betrayal and interpreting neutral behaviors as evidence of untrustworthiness. The betrayal memory transforms from specific historical event into general expectation that corrupts the person's ability to form genuine connections with others. Each new relationship becomes contaminated by memories of past betrayal that create defensive behaviors and emotional withdrawal that often produce the very rejection and abandonment that the person fears. Betrayal memories demonstrate how past suffering can create self-perpetuating cycles that generate fresh evidence supporting pessimistic expectations about human reliability and trustworthiness. Childhood memories of powerlessness and vulnerability create lasting psychological patterns that continue influencing adult behavior and emotional responses decades after the original circumstances have changed. The child who experienced parental rejection or abuse develops memory templates of danger and inadequacy that persist into adulthood despite achieving independence and competence. These early memories often operate below conscious awareness, but continue generating emotional responses and defensive behaviors that sabotage adult relationships and opportunities. The successful professional who continues feeling like a frightened child in authority relationships demonstrates how childhood memories can override present reality and maintain psychological patterns that no longer serve protective functions. Childhood memory patterns often become self-fulfilling prophecies that recreate familiar forms of rejection and conflict in adult contexts, confirming the person's deepest fears about their unworthiness and the world's hostility. These memories represent psychological time travel that traps consciousness in past developmental stages that prevent full engagement with present opportunities and relationships. Memory's selective encoding and retrieval systems ensure that negative experiences receive preferential storage and accessibility, while positive experiences fade into vague impressions that lose emotional impact. The person can recall in vivid detail every criticism received from a harsh teacher, but struggles to remember specific compliments or encouragement from supportive mentors. This memorial bias creates pessimistic worldviews based on incomplete data that over-represents threats and failures while under-representing support and success. Consciousness constructs narrative identities around detailed memories of suffering while losing access to equally important memories of resilience, competence, and positive connection. The person develops self-concepts based on their worst moments rather than their best ones, creating chronic feelings of inadequacy and vulnerability that affect confidence and decision-making in all life areas. Memory becomes an unreliable witness that provides distorted testimony about the person's capabilities and the world's trustworthiness, leading to defensive life strategies that limit growth and opportunity. Regret represents a uniquely human form of suffering that exists entirely within memory's capacity to compare actual outcomes with imagined alternatives. The person who chose one college over another continues wondering whether their life would have been better with different educational experiences. These counterfactual comparisons create elaborate alternative life narratives that highlight everything wrong with actual choices while idealizing paths not taken. Regret. Memories often become more compelling than present reality because imagination can construct perfect alternative outcomes that avoid all the complications and disappointments of actual experience. The person becomes trapped in mental time travel that prevents engagement with present opportunities while maintaining chronic dissatisfaction with choices that cannot be changed or undone. Regret demonstrates memory's capacity to create suffering from purely imaginary scenarios that exist only in consciousness, but generate real emotional pain that affects present relationships and decisions. Anticipatory memory creates additional suffering by projecting past negative experiences into future scenarios that may never occur. The person who experienced job rejection continues expecting similar rejection in all future employment situations, creating anxiety that affects interview performance and career development. Past memories become fortune-telling devices that predict negative outcomes based on selective historical evidence while ignoring changed circumstances and improved capabilities. This temporal confusion between past and future ensures that consciousness remains trapped in familiar patterns of expectation and defensive behavior that often create the very outcomes that memory predicts. Anticipatory memory transforms specific past events into general expectations about future suffering, creating chronic anxiety and avoidance behaviors that limit life experience and prevent the accumulation of positive memories that might balance the historical record of pain and disappointment. Memory becomes a prison that traps consciousness between past trauma and anticipated future suffering, while preventing full engagement with present opportunities for growth, connection, and satisfaction. Part 13. Language and Conceptual Thinking as Generators of Abstract Suffering. Human language creates entirely new categories of suffering that exist only in conceptual thinking and have no direct correspondence to immediate physical or emotional experience. Words enable consciousness to construct elaborate mental scenarios of hypothetical problems and imaginary inadequacies that generate real psychological distress despite having no basis in present reality. The capacity for abstract thought, which enables human culture and scientific understanding, also creates vulnerabilities to forms of suffering that remain invisible to creatures limited to immediate sensory experience. Language becomes a tool that consciousness uses to torture itself through conceptual elaboration of simple situations into complex psychological problems that exist primarily in linguistic description rather than lived experience. Consider how the simple word failure can transform neutral outcomes into sources of profound psychological distress through conceptual elaboration and social meaning. The student who receives a B grade on an examination has not objectively failed to learn the material or demonstrate competence in the subject area. However, the linguistic category of failure in academic contexts transforms this adequate performance into evidence of personal inadequacy and competitive disadvantage. The word creates comparison frameworks that generate suffering through relative positioning rather than absolute assessment of learning or growth. Without the conceptual category of failure, the student would simply note that they had learned most but not all of the material, and would adjust their study methods accordingly without experiencing shame, disappointment, or anxiety about their intellectual capabilities. Language transforms straightforward feedback about areas for improvement into existential threats to identity and self-worth that create lasting psychological damage. Social concepts like success and achievement create suffering by establishing artificial standards that have little relationship to genuine satisfaction or well-being, but exert enormous influence over self-evaluation and life choices. The person who has adequate income, meaningful work, and positive relationships can experience profound dissatisfaction because their circumstances do not match linguistic definitions of success that emphasize wealth accumulation, professional status, or public recognition. These conceptual frameworks prevent recognition and appreciation of genuine sources of satisfaction while creating chronic feelings of inadequacy based on arbitrary social definitions rather than personal experience or actual needs. The language of success becomes a measuring stick that makes most people feel like failures regardless of their objective circumstances or subjective well-being. Conceptual thinking transforms perfectly adequate lives into sources of disappointment and striving by comparing reality to linguistic abstractions that may have no relationship to human flourishing or genuine satisfaction. People sacrifice actual contentment in pursuit of conceptual achievements that exist primarily as social constructions rather than meaningful experiences. Moral language creates additional forms of conceptual suffering. By establishing categories of right and wrong that generate guilt, shame, and anxiety about behaviors that may be natural expressions of human psychology and biology. The person who experiences sexual attraction to someone other than their committed partner suffers from conceptual categories like infidelity and betrayal, even if they never act on their feelings. The language of moral purity creates impossible standards that make natural human impulses into sources of self-criticism and spiritual inadequacy. Without moral concepts, the person would simply notice their attraction as biological and psychological information without experiencing guilt or existential crisis about their character and worthiness. Moral language transforms natural human variability into psychological problems that require confession, therapy, or spiritual intervention to resolve conflicts that exist primarily in conceptual rather than experiential domains. The conceptual elaboration of simple human behaviors into moral categories creates artificial suffering that serves social control mechanisms rather than individual psychological health and authentic self-understanding. Psychological terminology creates new forms of suffering by providing labels for normal variations in human experience that transform temporary emotional states into permanent identity categories and medical conditions. The person who experiences periodic sadness begins identifying as depressed and constructs narrative identity around mental illness that may become more limiting than the original emotional fluctuations. Psychological language creates pathology categories that make normal human responses to difficult circumstances into evidence of personal dysfunction requiring professional intervention. The grieving person becomes diagnosed with complicated grief that transforms natural mourning processes into medical problems that need treatment rather than time and social support. Psychological concepts create suffering by suggesting that normal human emotional variability represents illness or inadequacy rather than natural responses to challenging circumstances that will naturally resolve through time and adaptation. The language of mental health becomes a source of additional anxiety and self-criticism that complicates natural healing processes and creates dependency on professional intervention for problems that humans have historically resolved through community support and personal resilience. Political and social justice language creates conceptual suffering by establishing frameworks of oppression, privilege and victimization that transform complex social situations into sources of identity-based grievance and perpetual conflict. Individuals learn to interpret their life experiences through concepts like discrimination and marginalization that may create psychological distress and limit self-efficacy, even when objective circumstances provide reasonable opportunities for growth and success. Social justice concepts can transform personal challenges and setbacks into evidence of systemic injustice that generates anger and helplessness, rather than problem-solving and personal agency. The conceptual framework creates suffering by encouraging people to focus on external barriers and historical grievances rather than present opportunities and personal capabilities for improvement and adaptation. Political language becomes a source of chronic victimization consciousness that maintains focus on injustice and inequality, while preventing recognition of personal power and available resources for creating satisfaction and meaning within current circumstances. Conceptual categories of social analysis create suffering by encouraging people to interpret their lives through frameworks of conflict and disadvantage rather than cooperation and possibility. Romantic language creates elaborate conceptual structures around love and relationships that generate unrealistic expectations and transform natural human pair bonding into sources of chronic dissatisfaction and spiritual yearning. The concepts of soulmates and true love create impossible standards that make ordinary relationship challenges into evidence of fundamental incompatibility or spiritual inadequacy. Romantic language transforms practical partnership and mutual support into cosmic significance that cannot be maintained through daily life and routine interaction. The person suffers because their relationship does not match conceptual ideals derived from literature, media, and cultural mythology rather than realistic understanding of human psychology and social cooperation. Romantic concepts create suffering by establishing expectations for emotional intensity and spiritual connection that cannot be sustained over time, making normal relationship evolution feel like failure or loss of authenticity rather than natural maturation and deepening of practical commitment. The language of romantic love becomes a source of perpetual dissatisfaction that prevents appreciation of genuine partnership and mutual care that exists in most successful long-term relationships. Schopenhauer recognized that conceptual thinking, while enabling human culture and technological advancement, also creates unprecedented possibilities for psychological suffering that exist entirely within linguistic and conceptual domains rather than immediate experience. Language provides tools for consciousness to elaborate simple situations into complex problems that generate real emotional distress despite having little basis in physical or social reality. The will uses conceptual thinking to create new forms of striving and dissatisfaction by establishing artificial standards and categories that make most people feel inadequate regardless of their objective circumstances or subjective experience. Understanding how language creates conceptual suffering provides opportunities for liberation through recognition that many psychological problems exist primarily in linguistic description rather than lived experience and can be resolved through changes in conceptual frameworks rather than external circumstances. The person who recognizes how words and concepts create artificial suffering can begin to question whether their psychological problems reflect genuine issues or linguistic constructions that exist primarily in abstract thinking, rather than immediate experience and practical needs. This awareness offers possibilities for reducing conceptual suffering through more careful attention to actual experience rather than linguistic elaboration of simple situations into complex psychological and spiritual problems that exist primarily in language rather than life. Part 14. The Artistic Temperament and Heightened Sensitivity to Universal Suffering. Artistic individuals experience suffering with greater intensity and complexity than the general population because their heightened sensitivity makes them more vulnerable to pain, while also providing deeper insight into the nature of human existence. The artist's refined nervous system registers subtle emotional fluctuations and environmental influences that others ignore or dismiss, creating rich inner lives that come at the cost of increased psychological fragility and social maladjustment. This heightened sensitivity serves artistic creation by providing access to emotional depths and perceptual subtleties necessary for meaningful creative expression, but it also condemns artists to experience ordinary life challenges as overwhelming psychological ordeals. The artistic temperament represents both blessing and curse, enabling profound creative achievement while creating vulnerability to forms of suffering that remain invisible to less sensitive individuals. The artist's perceptual sensitivity creates suffering through exposure to aesthetic and environmental discord that others experience as merely unpleasant background noise. The musician suffers acutely from poor sound quality, architectural acoustics, and sonic pollution that barely register in non-musical consciousness. Urban environments become sources of constant sensory assault rather than merely inconvenient aspects of modern life. The visual artist experiences psychological distress from ugly buildings, poor lighting, and aesthetic chaos that others navigate without conscious awareness or emotional response. This sensory hypersensitivity means that artists cannot find refuge from suffering in the aesthetic numbness that protects most people from environmental harshness and cultural degradation. They remain perpetually exposed to forms of ugliness and discord that create genuine psychological pain, while appearing trivial or irrelevant to individuals with less refined perceptual apparatus. Emotional sensitivity creates additional layers of artistic suffering because creative individuals experience both their own feelings and the emotions of others with unusual intensity and complexity. The artist absorbs emotional atmospheres and social tensions that others ignore or rationalize away, creating empathetic overload that can become psychologically overwhelming. They recognize subtle patterns of dishonesty, manipulation, and emotional dysfunction in social situations that others accept as normal human interaction. This emotional acuity provides material for artistic expression, but also creates isolation and cynicism about human relationships and social institutions. The artist often feels like they are the only person who recognizes obvious problems and patterns that everyone else seems determined to ignore or deny. This creates feelings of alienation and responsibility that can lead to depression and social withdrawal as defense mechanisms against empathetic overwhelm and frustrated social criticism. Intellectual complexity creates suffering for artistic individuals because they recognize philosophical and existential problems that simpler minds avoid through cognitive limitation and practical focus. The creative person confronts questions about meaning, mortality, and human nature that generate anxiety and depression among those capable of sustained abstract thinking. They cannot find comfort in conventional religious or cultural answers that satisfy less reflective individuals because their intellectual honesty prevents acceptance of comforting beliefs that lack logical consistency or empirical support. This intellectual isolation creates loneliness and existential despair that affects artistic production while providing the depth and authenticity that distinguishes meaningful art from commercial entertainment. The artist becomes trapped between the need for intellectual honesty that creates psychological suffering and the desire for community and belonging that requires accepting conventional beliefs and social values that they recognize as shallow or false. Intellectual integrity becomes a source of social isolation that affects both personal relationships and professional opportunities in cultures that reward conformity and optimism rather than depth and honesty. Creative individuals often experience their artistic gifts as compulsions rather than choices, creating additional suffering through loss of personal autonomy and normal life planning. The writer feels driven to create regardless of market demand or practical considerations, sacrificing financial security and family relationships for work that may never find appreciation or support. The artist cannot simply choose more practical careers because their creative drive operates independently of rational career planning and social expectations. This creates conflict between artistic integrity and practical survival that generates chronic stress and lifestyle instability. The creative person often feels enslaved by their own talents, unable to pursue conventional paths that might provide security and social acceptance, but would require abandoning their essential identity and purpose. Artistic compulsion becomes a form of noble suffering that provides meaning and authenticity while creating practical problems that affect every aspect of life, planning, and social integration. Social maladjustment creates ongoing suffering for artistic individuals because their sensitivity and depth often make them poorly suited for conventional social and professional environments. The artist struggles in corporate settings that require emotional suppression, competitive behavior, and focus on profit rather than meaning or aesthetic quality. Their natural honesty and intensity can be interpreted as inappropriate or unprofessional in contexts that reward diplomatic conformity and superficial positivity. This creates economic vulnerability and professional marginalization that affects practical survival while forcing compromise between artistic integrity and social adaptation. The creative person often faces choices between authentic self-expression that leads to social rejection and conformity that feels like psychological death, but enables practical success and social acceptance. Social institutions often fail to provide appropriate roles and support systems for individuals whose primary value lies in aesthetic sensitivity and creative production rather than practical problem-solving and social cooperation. Artistic creation itself becomes a source of suffering because the creative process involves exposing inner psychological material that may be painful or disturbing while risking public rejection and criticism. The artist must access emotional depths and personal experiences that others keep private, transforming their psychological vulnerabilities into public offerings that invite judgment and interpretation. Creative work requires sustained contact with one's own suffering and the suffering of humanity in general, preventing the emotional numbing and denial that protect most people from psychological overwhelm. The artist becomes a professional sufferer who must maintain sensitivity to pain in order to create authentic work, while society expects them to function normally in practical and social contexts. This creates impossible psychological demands that require maintaining openness to suffering for creative purposes while developing resilience for practical survival and social functioning. The creative person often oscillates between periods of intense artistic production that involve psychological risk and periods of emotional recovery that may involve creative sterility and loss of artistic identity. Schopenhauer understood that artistic individuals represent humanity's most sensitive instruments for detecting and expressing the universal suffering that underlies all existence. Their heightened sensitivity makes them ideal witnesses to the human condition, while also making them more vulnerable to the very suffering they observe and express through their work. Artists serve as cultural canaries in coal mines, providing early warning about social and psychological problems through their creative expression, while paying personal costs for their sensitivity and insight. Their suffering serves both individual artistic development and collective cultural understanding by creating works that help others recognize and process aspects of human experience that might otherwise remain unconscious or unexpressed. The artist's enhanced capacity for suffering represents both personal burden and social gift, enabling cultural evolution and psychological insight, while condemning sensitive individuals to experience life with intensity that often exceeds their capacity for adaptation and integration. Understanding artistic suffering provides insight into the general human condition by observing its most acute expressions in individuals whose sensitivity and creativity make them ideal subjects for studying the relationship between consciousness, creativity, and the fundamental suffering that characterizes human existence. Part 15. Social institutions as systematic organizations of suffering. Human societies create elaborate institutional structures that systematically generate and distribute suffering while claiming to promote order, justice, and collective well-being. These institutions transform individual suffering into organized social processes that serve power structures and economic systems rather than genuine human needs or authentic community cooperation. Educational systems, legal frameworks, economic arrangements, and political organizations operate as suffering production mechanisms that create predictable forms of psychological distress while preventing recognition of their fundamental role in generating rather than solving human problems. Social institutions represent the collective manifestation of the will's drive to perpetuate itself through organized conflict, competition, and systematic inequality that ensures continuous striving and dissatisfaction among all participants. Educational institutions create systematic suffering through competitive ranking systems that transform natural learning processes into sources of anxiety, inadequacy, and social stratification. Schools organize children into hierarchical structures based on arbitrary academic measures that have little relationship to intelligence, creativity, or genuine capability for contribution to human culture and community life. The grading system creates artificial scarcity of recognition and approval that forces students to compete against each other rather than collaborate in learning and mutual support. Students learn to measure their worth through external validation from authority figures, rather than developing intrinsic satisfaction with learning and personal growth. This institutional structure produces chronic anxiety about performance evaluation that persists throughout adult life, and prevents genuine intellectual curiosity and creative exploration that might threaten established academic hierarchies. Educational institutions serve economic systems by producing compliant workers rather than independent thinkers, using psychological pressure and social conditioning to create individuals who accept competitive ranking and external authority as natural features of human organization. Legal systems institutionalize suffering through adversarial processes that transform conflicts into win-lose competitions that generate additional trauma and social division beyond the original problems they claim to resolve. Courts create formal procedures that require expensive professional representation and complex rule following that most people cannot navigate without significant financial and emotional costs. The legal system transforms personal disputes into technical battles between professional advocates who have economic incentives to prolong rather than resolve conflicts efficiently and compassionately. Crime and punishment frameworks create additional suffering through retribution rather than restoration, ensuring that harmful behaviors generate cycles of vengeance rather than healing and community repair. Legal institutions serve existing power structures by creating barriers to justice that protect established interests, while appearing to provide equal protection under abstract principles that function differently for individuals with different economic and social resources. The complexity and expense of legal processes ensure that most people cannot effectively challenge institutional abuse or seek meaningful redress for legitimate grievances, creating systematic protection for organized forms of exploitation and harm. Economic institutions create the most pervasive forms of systematic suffering by organizing society around artificial scarcity and competitive resource acquisition that transforms natural cooperation into perpetual conflict over survival needs. Capitalism requires continuous economic growth that depends on maintaining dissatisfaction and competitive striving among all participants in economic systems. The institution of private property creates artificial distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate access to natural resources that should be available for all human beings to meet their basic survival and flourishing needs. Employment relationships create systematic power imbalances that force most people to spend their productive energy serving other people's goals rather than pursuing their own interests and creative development. Economic institutions generate systematic inequality that ensures that some people will always lack adequate resources while others accumulate far more than they can possibly use, creating social tensions and competitive pressures that affect every aspect of community life and individual psychological development. The requirement to compete for employment, housing, and basic resources creates chronic anxiety and social mistrust that prevents the cooperative relationships and mutual support that characterize healthy human communities throughout most of history. Political institutions create systematic suffering by concentrating decision-making power in hierarchical structures that remove most people from meaningful participation in choices that affect their lives and communities. Democratic systems create illusions of participation while actually channeling political energy into symbolic activities that do not challenge fundamental power arrangements or economic systems that generate systematic inequality and social conflict. Electoral processes transform complex social problems into entertainment spectacles that focus attention on personality conflicts between political candidates rather than substantive analysis of institutional structures that create ongoing social problems. Political institutions serve economic elites by providing legitimacy for policies that benefit concentrated wealth, while creating appearance of popular participation in governance through voting processes that offer limited choices between candidates who serve similar economic interests. The complexity of political systems ensures that most people cannot understand or effectively influence government policies that affect their daily lives, creating feelings of powerlessness and civic alienation that undermine community solidarity and individual agency for social change. Political institutions channel social discontent into partisan conflict that divides potential allies, while protecting the underlying economic arrangements that generate the inequality and social problems that create political dissatisfaction in the first place. Healthcare institutions create systematic suffering by transforming natural healing processes and community care into profitable medical services that create dependency on expensive professional interventions for problems that communities have historically addressed through mutual support and practical assistance. Medical systems focus on disease treatment rather than health promotion, creating economic incentives for maintaining rather than preventing illness, while ignoring social and environmental factors that create most health problems. The medicalization of normal human emotional and behavioral variations transforms natural responses to difficult circumstances into pathological conditions that require professional treatment rather than community support and lifestyle changes. Healthcare institutions serve pharmaceutical and medical technology industries by creating markets for expensive interventions, while ignoring less profitable approaches to health and healing that emphasize prevention, community support, and individual responsibility for lifestyle choices. Medical systems create additional suffering through side effects of treatments, iatrogenic complications, and the anxiety and helplessness that result from surrendering personal responsibility for health to professional experts who may have economic incentives that conflict with patient well-being. Healthcare institutions transform the natural processes of aging, illness, and death into medical problems that require expensive technological intervention rather than community support and acceptance of natural life cycles that include suffering as normal and meaningful aspects of human experience. Religious institutions create systematic suffering by transforming natural spiritual impulses and community connection into hierarchical organizations that control access to meaning and transcendence through professional priesthoods and complex theological systems. Religious institutions create artificial distinctions between sacred and secular experience that prevent recognition of spiritual dimensions in daily life, while requiring dependence on institutional mediation for connection to transcendent meaning and community belonging. Organized religion transforms personal spiritual exploration into conformity to established doctrines and social practices that may conflict with individual psychological development and authentic spiritual experience. Religious institutions serve social control functions by encouraging acceptance of unjust social arrangements through promises of otherworldly compensation, while discouraging critical analysis of institutional structures that create systematic suffering and inequality. The complexity of religious doctrines and practices creates barriers to spiritual understanding that require professional interpretation and guidance, preventing direct spiritual experience and creating dependency on religious authorities who may have institutional interests that conflict with genuine spiritual development and community well-being. Religious institutions channel natural human impulses toward transcendence and community into organized systems that often reproduce the same patterns of hierarchy, competition, and social control that characterize secular institutions, while claiming divine authority for human power structures. Schopenhauer recognized that social institutions represent collective manifestations of the will's drive to perpetuate itself through organized forms of striving and competition that ensure continuous suffering and prevent recognition of alternative approaches to human organization based on genuine cooperation and mutual support. Institutions serve the will by creating systematic methods for generating and distributing suffering while maintaining the illusion that they exist to solve human problems and promote collective well-being. Understanding how institutions create systematic suffering reveals opportunities for individual liberation through reduced participation in competitive systems and increased focus on direct community cooperation and mutual aid that bypass institutional mediation and control. Recognition of institutional sources of suffering can motivate exploration of alternative forms of social organization that serve genuine human needs rather than abstract institutional purposes that maintain existing power structures while claiming to serve collective interests that they actually undermine through systematic generation of competition, inequality, and social conflict. Individual understanding of institutional suffering represents the first step towards creating alternative forms of community organization that support human flourishing rather than institutional perpetuation and systematic suffering generation that serves the will's purposes rather than genuine human well-being and authentic community cooperation. This awareness offers possibilities for reducing institutional suffering through conscious choices to minimize participation in competitive systems while developing alternative approaches to meeting practical needs through direct cooperation and mutual support that bypass institutional mediation and control. Part 16. Gender and the Differential Distribution of Suffering. Schopenhauer observed that biological sexual differences create distinct patterns of suffering for men and women because the will manifests differently through male and female psychology and social roles. These differences are not merely cultural constructions, but reflect fundamental biological imperatives that shape consciousness and create gender-specific vulnerabilities to particular forms of psychological and social distress. Understanding how gender influences suffering patterns reveals the will's sophisticated methods for ensuring reproductive success through complementary forms of male and female striving that serve biological rather than individual purposes. Both sexes experience unique forms of suffering that reflect their different biological roles in reproduction and child-rearing, but neither recognizes how their gender-specific struggles serve the will's agenda rather than their personal happiness and fulfillment. Women experience distinctive suffering through their biological role in reproduction, which subjects them to physical and emotional demands that men cannot directly understand or share. Menstruation creates monthly cycles of hormonal fluctuation that affect mood, energy, and psychological stability in ways that influence every aspect of life planning and emotional regulation. Pregnancy and childbirth subject women to profound physical changes and medical risks that can permanently alter their health and psychological relationship to their bodies. These biological realities create forms of suffering that exist independently of social arrangements or personal choices, demonstrating how the will uses female biology to ensure species continuation regardless of individual preferences or well-being. The intensity of maternal attachment creates additional suffering because mothers cannot protect their children from all threats and must watch their offspring face dangers and disappointments that cause intense empathetic distress. Women often sacrifice their own development and interest for children who will eventually become independent and may not provide the gratitude or closeness that might compensate for maternal sacrifice and dedication. Female sexuality creates complex psychological suffering because women must balance biological drives for sexual connection with social and economic realities that make sexual choices particularly consequential for their safety and long-term security. The potential for pregnancy and the physical vulnerabilities associated with sexual activity create risk assessments that men rarely consider when making sexual choices. Women often experience internal conflicts between sexual desire and practical considerations about partner selection that reflect genuine biological and social realities rather than cultural repression or psychological dysfunction. The biological clock creates additional temporal pressure that affects female decision-making about career development, relationship choices and life planning in ways that men experience less acutely because of different reproductive timelines. Female sexual satisfaction often depends on emotional trust and relational security that require longer-term commitment and relationship development, creating vulnerability to male sexual strategies that emphasize physical attraction and short-term mating opportunities. These biological differences create gender conflicts that generate suffering for both sexes, but affect women more severely because of their greater investment in reproduction and child-rearing activities. Men experience distinct forms of suffering through competitive social hierarchies that demand continuous performance and achievement to maintain status and access to resources and sexual opportunities. Male biology creates drives for dominance and resource accumulation that condemn men to perpetual competition with other males for social position and female attention. The male ego requires constant validation through achievement and recognition that creates chronic anxiety about performance and status maintenance in professional and social contexts. Men often sacrifice personal interests and authentic self-expression for career advancement and social status that serve reproductive success, rather than genuine satisfaction and personal development. Male sexual psychology creates suffering through desires for sexual variety and novelty that conflict with social expectations about monogamy and long-term commitment that serve female interests and child-rearing requirements but frustrate natural male sexual impulses. The social expectation that men suppress emotional vulnerability and maintain stoic strength prevents authentic emotional expression and creates isolation and psychological pressure that affects mental health and relationship capacity. Economic gender roles create systematic suffering by forcing both sexes into complementary but limiting social positions that serve reproductive functions rather than individual development and authentic self-expression. Traditional male breadwinner roles create pressure to prioritize financial success over personal interests and family relationships, leading to workaholism and emotional distance from children and partners. Female domestic roles often require sacrificing intellectual and creative development for childcare responsibilities that may not provide adequate stimulation or social recognition for women with professional ambitions and capabilities. Modern attempts to eliminate gender role differences often create additional suffering by requiring individuals to perform both traditional male and female functions simultaneously, leading to exhaustion and role confusion rather than liberation from gender-based limitations. The economic necessity for dual-career families creates scheduling and childcare challenges that affect both parents while providing less than optimal care for children who require more attention and stability than working parents can provide. Gender role flexibility often increases rather than decreases suffering by creating more choices and possibilities that generate decision-making anxiety and role conflict without eliminating the underlying biological differences that make certain social arrangements more psychologically satisfying than others. Romantic relationships create gender-specific suffering because male and female strategies for mate selection and relationship maintenance often conflict in ways that generate mutual frustration and disappointment. Female tendencies toward emotional connection and long-term security conflict with male tendencies toward sexual novelty and independence, creating ongoing negotiations that satisfy neither partner completely. Men often feel trapped by female demands for emotional intimacy and relationship processing, while women feel frustrated by male emotional unavailability and resistance to relationship development. These conflicts reflect genuine biological differences in reproductive strategies rather than personality flaws or cultural conditioning, making them particularly difficult to resolve through communication or therapy alone. Female sexual selectivity and male sexual opportunism create ongoing tensions about fidelity and commitment that affect relationship stability and individual satisfaction with partnership arrangements. The biological basis of these gender differences means that relationship conflicts often persist despite good intentions and mutual effort, because they serve reproductive functions that operate independently of conscious relationship goals and individual preferences for harmony and mutual satisfaction. Social expectations about gender behavior create additional suffering by requiring men and women to suppress aspects of their natural psychology that do not conform to cultural ideals about masculine and feminine behavior. Women may feel pressure to suppress competitive and aggressive impulses that conflict with social expectations about feminine nurturing and cooperation. Men may feel obligated to suppress emotional sensitivity and artistic interests that conflict with masculine ideals about strength and practical achievement. These social pressures force individuals to deny aspects of their authentic personality while overemphasizing gender-typical traits that may not represent their complete psychological makeup and individual interests. Modern gender equality movements often increase rather than decrease this suffering by creating pressure to demonstrate that gender differences are purely cultural, rather than acknowledging the biological foundations of psychological differences that create different strengths and vulnerabilities for men and women. The attempt to eliminate gender-based expectations often creates additional performance pressure and identity confusion, without addressing the underlying biological factors that make certain behavioral patterns more natural and satisfying for males and females, despite cultural variation and individual differences within gender categories. Schopenhauer understood that gender differences in suffering patterns reflect the will's sophisticated strategy for ensuring reproductive success through complementary male and female psychology that serves species continuation rather than individual happiness. Both sexes experience forms of suffering that motivate behaviors necessary for successful reproduction and child-rearing, while creating the illusion that gender-specific struggles serve personal rather than biological purposes. Recognition of how gender shapes suffering patterns can reduce individual self-criticism and relationship conflicts, by understanding that many gender-based difficulties reflect biological rather than personal inadequacies or relationship failures. This awareness offers possibilities for greater self-acceptance and more realistic relationship expectations that acknowledge genuine differences between male and female psychology, while avoiding both traditional gender role rigidity and modern attempts to eliminate all gender-based behavioral patterns that may actually serve important biological and psychological functions. Understanding gender-specific suffering provides opportunities for more compassionate relationships that acknowledge and accommodate biological differences rather than demanding impossible equality in areas where men and women naturally differ in their psychological needs and behavioral tendencies that reflect evolutionary rather than cultural factors. This recognition can reduce gender-based suffering through greater acceptance of natural differences, while maintaining commitment to equal opportunities and social respect for both sexes despite their different psychological characteristics and life challenges. Part 17. Mental illness as extreme manifestation of universal suffering patterns. Mental illness represents the intensification and concentration of suffering patterns that exist in milder forms throughout normal human experience, rather than qualitatively different conditions that affect only a minority of the population. The person diagnosed with depression experiences the same fundamental dissatisfaction and hopelessness that characterizes ordinary life, but with sufficient intensity and persistence to interfere with social functioning and personal adaptation. Understanding mental illness as extreme manifestation of universal suffering patterns reveals how psychiatric conditions represent breakdown points in the psychological defense mechanisms that usually enable people to function despite underlying existential problems. Mental illness provides a magnifying glass for examining the basic structure of human suffering by observing its most acute and visible expressions in individuals whose psychological defenses have failed to maintain the illusion of normal adaptation and life satisfaction. Depression demonstrates most clearly how mental illness intensifies normal patterns of existential dissatisfaction and hopelessness about finding meaning and satisfaction through external achievements and relationships. The depressed person experiences the same recognition of life's futility and meaninglessness that philosophers and artists have documented throughout history. But without the intellectual framework or creative outlets that might provide some compensation for existential insights. Depression often involves accurate perception of social hypocrisy, environmental destruction, and human cruelty that optimistic individuals ignore or rationalize away through psychological defense mechanisms. The depressed person may actually see reality more clearly than those who maintain positive illusions about human nature and social progress, but lack the psychological resilience necessary to function effectively with such knowledge. Antidepressant medications often work by reducing insight and sensitivity rather than addressing the genuine problems that create depressive responses to difficult circumstances and existential realities. Depression represents the natural psychological response to recognizing the extent of human suffering and the futility of conventional approaches to finding lasting satisfaction and meaning through external achievements and social relationships. Anxiety disorders reveal the normal human condition of uncertainty and vulnerability that most people manage through denial, distraction, and optimistic bias about future outcomes and personal safety. The anxious person recognizes genuine threats and uncertainties that exist in every human life, but experiences them with intensity that prevents normal functioning and adaptive behavior. Social anxiety reflects accurate perception of how much human interaction involves judgment, competition, and potential rejection that confident individuals ignore or minimize through self-deception and social skills that mask underlying insecurities. Generalized anxiety represents the natural response to recognizing how little control people actually have over their health, relationships, financial security, and life outcomes that normally remain unconscious or suppressed. Panic attacks often involve accurate recognition of mortality and physical vulnerability that typically remain below conscious awareness, but can intrude into consciousness with overwhelming intensity when defense mechanisms fail. Anxiety disorders demonstrate how much psychological energy is normally devoted to suppressing awareness of genuine dangers and uncertainties that make human life inherently precarious and unpredictable, despite cultural narratives about progress and personal control over life outcomes. Obsessive-compulsive disorder illustrates the normal human tendency toward repetitive behavior and magical thinking that becomes dysfunctional when applied with excessive intensity and frequency to everyday activities. Everyone engages in ritualistic behaviors and superstitious thinking to manage anxiety about uncertain outcomes. But OCD patients cannot limit these behaviors to socially acceptable levels or practical effectiveness. The obsessive focus on contamination, harm, or orderliness reflects genuine concerns about safety and control that affect all human beings, but become overwhelming when not balanced by other psychological processes and social functioning. Compulsive behaviors represent exaggerated versions of normal self-care and precautionary activities that serve legitimate protective functions when maintained within reasonable limits. OCD demonstrates how quickly normal psychological processes can become pathological when the volume and intensity exceed the person's capacity for integration and social adaptation. The disorder reveals the arbitrary nature of the boundary between normal and abnormal behavior. Since many OCD symptoms differ from normal behavior primarily in degree rather than fundamental character or underlying psychological purpose. Personality disorders represent extreme expressions of character traits and coping strategies that exist in milder forms throughout the normal population, and often serve adaptive functions in certain contexts. Narcissistic personality disorder involves exaggerated versions of the self-promotion and grandiose thinking that characterize successful politicians, entertainers, and business leaders in competitive social environments. Borderline personality disorder reflects extreme versions of the emotional instability and relationship difficulties that affect many people who have experienced trauma or inconsistent caregiving during psychological development. Antisocial personality disorder represents the logical extreme of competitive individualism and disregard for social cooperation that characterizes normal behavior in certain economic and political contexts. These personality patterns become problematic primarily when they interfere with social relationships and personal adaptation, rather than representing fundamentally different psychological structures from normal personality development. Understanding personality disorders as extreme expressions of normal traits reveals how much ordinary social functioning depends on maintaining psychological balance and social skills that can be disrupted by circumstances or developmental factors that affect anyone. Psychotic disorders reveal the normal human tendency toward meaning-making and pattern recognition that becomes dysfunctional when applied to random or irrelevant information with excessive confidence and social isolation. Everyone experiences intrusive thoughts, perceptual anomalies, and suspicious interpretations of ambiguous social situations. But psychotic individuals cannot distinguish between meaningful and meaningless patterns in their experience. Delusions represent exaggerated versions of the conspiracy thinking and paranoid interpretations that characterize normal responses to genuine social threats and institutional deception. Hallucinations may involve the same perceptual and imaginative processes that create vivid dreams, artistic inspiration, and spiritual experiences, but occur during waking consciousness without appropriate reality testing. Psychotic disorders demonstrate how quickly normal psychological processes can become pathological when social support and reality feedback mechanisms are disrupted, or when individual vulnerability exceeds coping capacity. The content of psychotic symptoms often reflects genuine social problems and personal concerns, but expressed through psychological mechanisms that prevent effective communication and problem-solving rather than representing completely irrational or meaningless mental phenomena. Addiction represents the extreme expression of normal human tendencies toward pleasure-seeking and pain avoidance that become self-defeating when applied to substances or behaviors that provide temporary relief while creating long-term problems. Everyone uses various substances and activities to regulate mood and cope with stress, but addicted individuals cannot limit their consumption to levels that maintain social functioning and personal health. Substance abuse often begins as rational response to genuine psychological pain or social circumstances that exceed the person's coping capacity without chemical assistance. The progression from use to abuse to addiction represents the logical development of normal coping strategies when applied to substances that alter brain chemistry in ways that interfere with natural regulation and decision-making processes. Addiction demonstrates how normal pleasure-seeking behavior can become pathological when the substances or activities involved override natural psychological and social feedback mechanisms that usually maintain behavioral balance. Understanding addiction as extreme expression of normal coping reveals how environmental and social factors that create suffering often contribute more to addictive behavior than individual moral weakness or personality defects that are often blamed for substance abuse problems. Schopenhauer recognized that mental illness represents the breakdown of psychological defense mechanisms that normally enable people to function despite the fundamental suffering and meaninglessness that characterize human existence. Mental health depends on maintaining effective illusions and adaptive behaviors that provide enough satisfaction and social connection to prevent complete despair and dysfunction. Mental illness occurs when circumstances or individual vulnerability exceed the capacity for psychological adaptation and social functioning that normal defense mechanisms usually provide. Understanding mental illness as extreme manifestation of universal suffering patterns reduces stigma and increases compassion by recognizing that psychological disorders represent intensification of problems that affect everyone rather than fundamental defects that separate mentally ill individuals from normal population. This perspective suggests that mental health treatment should focus on strengthening adaptive capacity and social support rather than simply suppressing symptoms or correcting presumed chemical imbalances that may actually reflect rational responses to genuinely difficult circumstances and existential realities. Mental illness provides valuable insight into the nature of human suffering by revealing what happens when normal psychological defenses fail to maintain the illusions and adaptive behaviors that enable most people to function despite underlying existential problems that mental illness makes visible and unavoidable. Part 18. The transition from youth to age and the evolution of suffering. The progression from youth through middle age to old age reveals how the forms and intensity of human suffering change across the lifespan, while the fundamental condition of dissatisfaction remains constant throughout all developmental stages. Each life phase brings distinct vulnerabilities and challenges that replace rather than eliminate previous sources of distress, demonstrating that maturation provides no escape from suffering, but merely substitutes new problems for old ones. Understanding how suffering evolves across the lifespan reveals the will's sophisticated strategy for maintaining motivation and striving throughout all phases of biological and psychological development. The changing nature of age-related suffering ensures that individuals never achieve lasting peace or satisfaction, but remain engaged with life's demands until death terminates their capacity for further experience and effort. Youth creates distinctive forms of suffering through inexperience and intensity that make every emotion and social situation feel overwhelming and permanently significant. The young person lacks historical perspective, that might reveal how temporary most problems and achievements actually prove to be over longer time periods. Romantic rejection in youth feels like permanent devastation because the person has not yet accumulated evidence that such experiences are temporary and that other opportunities will arise. Academic and social failures seem to threaten entire future prospects because young people have not yet learned how little correlation exists between early performance and eventual life satisfaction and success. Youth suffering often involves dramatic emotional intensity that adults remember as somehow more authentic and meaningful than later experiences, despite its foundation in ignorance and limited perspective. The young person experiences life with sensitivity and passion that creates both intense joy and devastating disappointment that moderate with age and experience but never return with the same vivid emotional colouring. Early adulthood transforms youthful emotional intensity into practical anxiety about career development, relationship formation, and life direction that must be decided without adequate information about their long-term consequences. The pressure to make major life choices during the 20s and 30s creates systematic suffering because these decisions about education, career, marriage and geography must be made before the person has enough experience to understand their own values and capabilities. Young adults often feel they are falling behind peers in career advancement or relationship development, creating competitive pressure that affects every aspect of social interaction and personal satisfaction. The biological clock creates additional temporal pressure for women that affects relationship choices and career planning in ways that men experience less acutely, but that create gender-specific anxiety about timing major life decisions. Early adulthood suffering often focuses on external achievement and social comparison rather than internal development and authentic self-understanding that might provide more sustainable sources of satisfaction and meaning. The pressure to establish independent adult identity while maintaining family relationships creates developmental challenges that require balancing individual autonomy with social connection in ways that satisfy neither personal desires for freedom nor family expectations for continued closeness and involvement. Middle age introduces new forms of suffering through recognition that many youthful dreams and ambitions will never be realized, and that time limitations make major life changes increasingly difficult and costly. The middle-aged person confronts the reality that their career trajectory is largely established and that dramatic improvements in professional status or personal circumstances become less likely with advancing age. Physical changes become noticeable and create awareness of aging and mortality that affect self-image and confidence in ways that young people cannot anticipate or understand. Responsibility for aging parents while supporting adolescent children creates sandwich generation pressures that affect both financial resources and emotional energy available for personal development and relationship maintenance. Middle age often involves recognition that marriage and family relationships have not provided the satisfaction and completeness that romantic and parental idealism promised during youth and early adulthood. The accumulation of disappointments and unmet expectations creates cynicism and resignation that affects motivation and openness to new experiences while offering little compensation through wisdom or acceptance that might provide alternative sources of meaning and satisfaction. Old age creates unique forms of suffering through physical decline, social isolation, and proximity to death that cannot be avoided through positive thinking or lifestyle modification. Aging bodies impose increasing limitations on activity and independence that affect every aspect of daily life and personal identity. For individuals who have defined themselves through physical competence and social engagement. Retirement often eliminates primary sources of social connection and personal meaning that careers provided, leaving older adults without clear roles or purposes that justify continued existence and effort. The death of spouse and friends creates loneliness and grief that accumulates throughout later life while reducing social support networks that previously provided emotional connection and practical assistance. Older adults must confront the reality that their life achievements and accumulated possessions will have little lasting significance after their death, while facing increasing dependence on others for basic care and survival needs. Aging involves watching physical and mental capabilities decline in ways that create helplessness and loss of dignity that affect self-concept and relationships with family members, who must witness and accommodate progressive deterioration in someone they remember as competent and independent. Each life stage involves specific illusions and defense mechanisms that protect consciousness from recognizing the fundamental futility of seeking lasting satisfaction through external achievements and relationships. Youth maintains optimism through inexperience and emotional intensity that make temporary pleasures feel permanent and significant. Early adulthood focuses on goal achievement and relationship building that promise eventual security and fulfillment through proper planning and effort. Middle age often involves acceptance of limitation, combined with appreciation for stability and gradual development that cannot provide dramatic satisfaction, but offers steady, if modest, sources of meaning and connection. Old age may develop wisdom and acceptance that reduces striving and competitive pressure, while acknowledging that such peace comes primarily through exhaustion and reduced capacity, rather than genuine spiritual development or philosophical insight. These age-related adaptations represent different strategies for managing the same fundamental problem of finding meaning and satisfaction in existence that provides neither permanent security nor lasting pleasure, regardless of life stage or individual circumstances. The biological basis of age-related suffering patterns reveals how the will uses different psychological strategies throughout the lifespan to maintain engagement and reproduction, while preventing recognition that all life stages involve the same underlying condition of dissatisfaction and temporal limitation. Youth provides energy and optimism necessary for mate selection and career development, while middle age focuses on child-rearing and resource accumulation that serve reproductive success. Old age eliminates reproductive capacity, but may contribute to species success through grandparenting and cultural transmission that benefit younger generations. Each life stage serves biological purposes that may conflict with individual happiness and authentic self-development, while maintaining the illusion that personal goals and social roles provide genuine meaning and satisfaction. Understanding how suffering evolves across the lifespan reveals the consistency of human dissatisfaction, despite changing circumstances and developmental achievements that appear to provide progress towards greater wisdom and life satisfaction. This recognition offers possibilities for accepting the universality of suffering while reducing age-specific self-criticism and unrealistic expectations about what different life stages can provide in terms of lasting peace and fulfillment that transcends the fundamental limitations of human existence and consciousness. Part 19. Technology and the modern amplification of ancient suffering patterns. Modern technology has not eliminated traditional sources of human suffering, but has instead amplified and accelerated ancient patterns of desire, comparison, and dissatisfaction through digital communication and global connectivity. Rather than providing liberation from the fundamental problems of human existence, technological advancement has created new vehicles for the will to express itself through expanded opportunities for competition, status anxiety, and addictive behavior. Technology serves the same psychological functions as earlier cultural developments, by providing increasingly sophisticated methods for generating and maintaining the dissatisfaction that motivates continued striving and consumption. Understanding how technology amplifies rather than eliminates suffering reveals why material progress has not produced corresponding increases in human happiness and life satisfaction despite unprecedented prosperity and convenience. Social media platforms create systematic suffering by transforming normal social comparison into continuous exposure to curated presentations of other people's apparent success and happiness. Users compare their internal experience of struggle and dissatisfaction with others' carefully edited external presentations that hide difficulties and emphasize achievements and positive experiences. This creates impossible standards for life satisfaction that no actual experience can match, because social media presentations represent selective highlight reels rather than realistic portrayals of normal human experience. The constant availability of comparison opportunities through smartphones and social networking prevents the natural limitation of social comparison that geographical and social boundaries previously provided. Social media algorithms amplify comparison-based suffering by showing users content from individuals with superior resources, achievements, and lifestyle advantages, while hiding examples of people with more limited circumstances that might provide perspective and gratitude. The addictive design of social platforms ensures that users continue engaging despite negative psychological effects, because intermittent reinforcement through likes, comments, and social validation creates behavioral patterns similar to gambling addiction. Online dating technology transforms romantic relationships into consumer experiences that increase, rather than decrease, the difficulty of forming lasting emotional connections and mutual commitment. Dating applications create artificial abundance of romantic options that prevents users from investing sufficient time and energy in developing relationships with compatible partners. The swipe-based selection process reduces potential partners to superficial visual and demographic characteristics that have little relationship to compatibility and long-term relationship satisfaction. Online dating creates expectation that perfect romantic matches can be found through search algorithms and optimization, rather than through gradual development of mutual understanding and emotional connection over time. The constant availability of alternative partners through dating applications undermines commitment and relationship investment by maintaining the illusion that better options remain available through continued searching and profile optimization. Dating technology serves consumer capitalism by treating relationships as products to be acquired rather than developed, while generating subscription revenue through user dissatisfaction that motivates continued platform engagement and premium service purchases. Information technology creates new forms of suffering through continuous exposure to global problems and threats that individuals cannot influence or resolve through personal action. News media and social networking provide constant updates about environmental destruction, political corruption, violence, and social injustice that create anxiety and helplessness without providing practical opportunities for meaningful response or solution. The human brain evolved to process local threats and opportunities, but now receives overwhelming amounts of negative information from around the world that creates chronic stress and pessimistic worldviews. Information overload prevents the focused attention necessary for deep learning and creative work, while creating addictive behaviors around news consumption and social media engagement that provide stimulation without satisfaction. The speed and volume of digital information prevents contemplative reflection and wise decision-making, while creating pressure for immediate responses and opinions about complex issues that require careful analysis and philosophical consideration. Information technology creates the illusion of knowledge and understanding, while actually preventing the slow, careful thinking necessary for wisdom and authentic personal development through overwhelming consciousness with superficial data and emotional stimulation. Consumer technology amplifies material desire through sophisticated marketing algorithms that target individual psychological vulnerabilities and consumption patterns. Online advertising uses personal data to create customized temptation that makes resistance to unnecessary purchases more difficult than traditional marketing approaches that use general demographic targeting. E-commerce platforms use artificial intelligence to predict and stimulate consumer desires while providing instant gratification through one-click purchasing that bypasses natural reflection periods that might prevent impulse buying. Technology companies use behavioral psychology research to create addictive product designs that maximize user engagement and data collection while minimizing user satisfaction and well-being. The convenience of digital shopping and entertainment creates expectation for instant gratification that reduces tolerance for delayed gratification and persistence through difficulty that characterize genuine achievement and personal development. Consumer technology serves corporate interests by creating artificial needs and desires that generate revenue through planned obsolescence and continuous upgrade cycles while providing products that become outdated or unsatisfying shortly after purchase. Entertainment technology creates new forms of suffering through passive consumption that provides temporary escape from reality while preventing the active engagement necessary for genuine skill development and creative expression. Streaming media services use recommendation algorithms to maintain user attention through binge-watching behaviors that provide short-term pleasure while creating longer-term regret and time waste. Video games create addictive reward schedules that provide achievements and social connection through virtual environments while reducing motivation for real-world accomplishment and relationship development. Entertainment technology often promotes unrealistic expectations about excitement and stimulation that make normal life experience seem boring and inadequate by comparison. The constant availability of digital entertainment prevents the natural boredom that historically motivated creative projects and personal development while providing artificial stimulation that satisfies short-term attention needs without longer-term meaning or satisfaction. Entertainment consumption becomes a form of digital drug that provides temporary mood alteration while creating dependency and tolerance that require increasing amounts of stimulation to achieve the same psychological effects. Surveillance technology creates new forms of anxiety through constant monitoring and data collection that affects behavior and psychological privacy even when individuals have nothing to hide from legitimate authorities. The knowledge that digital activities are recorded and analyzed creates self-consciousness and conformity pressure that reduces authentic self-expression and experimental behavior necessary for personal growth and social innovation. Surveillance systems serve corporate and governmental interests by creating detailed profiles of individual behavior that can be used for manipulation and control, while providing little benefit to the individuals whose privacy is compromised. Digital surveillance creates paranoid worldviews by making abstract threats feel immediate and personal through knowledge that personal information is being collected and potentially misused by unknown parties for undisclosed purposes. The loss of privacy affects psychological development by preventing the private reflection and experimentation that require freedom from observation and judgment by others. Surveillance technology creates social compliance through fear and self-censorship while claiming to provide security benefits that may be largely illusory given the persistence of traditional threats and the creation of new vulnerabilities through digital infrastructure and data collection. Schopenhauer would recognize that modern technology represents the latest expression of the will's drive to create new forms of striving and dissatisfaction that serve technological development and economic growth rather than genuine human flourishing and life satisfaction. Technology amplifies ancient suffering patterns by providing more sophisticated tools for competition, comparison, and addictive behavior, while maintaining the illusion that technological solutions can eliminate fundamental problems of human existence. Understanding how technology amplifies rather than eliminates suffering provides opportunities for more conscious engagement with digital tools that serve authentic human needs rather than corporate interests and psychological manipulation. This awareness suggests approaches to technology use that minimize exposure to comparison and addictive features while maximizing benefits for learning, creativity, and genuine human connection that technology can provide when used thoughtfully and selectively. Recognition of technology's role in amplifying suffering offers possibilities for individual liberation through reduced digital consumption and increased focus on direct experience and local community that bypass technological mediation and provide more sustainable sources of satisfaction and meaning. This understanding reveals why technological progress has not produced corresponding increases in human happiness, while providing guidance for using technology in ways that serve rather than undermine genuine well-being and authentic human development. Part 20. Practical Methods for Minimizing Suffering. Despite his reputation for unrelenting pessimism, Schopenhauer offered specific practical methods for reducing suffering that do not require complete philosophical conversion or monastic withdrawal from ordinary social life. These techniques focus on understanding and working with the mechanisms of suffering rather than futilely attempting to eliminate all sources of dissatisfaction through external changes and achievements. His practical philosophy emphasizes reduction rather than elimination of suffering, while providing realistic methods for achieving greater equanimity and reduced reactivity to circumstances that cannot be controlled or permanently altered. These approaches offer hope for meaningful improvement in life satisfaction, without requiring unrealistic optimism about human nature, or the possibilities for complete liberation from the fundamental challenges of conscious existence. The first practical method involves cultivating aesthetic appreciation that provides temporary but renewable escape from the pressures of personal willing and desire. Schopenhauer recommended regular engagement with art, music, literature, and natural beauty that allows consciousness to transcend individual concerns and merge temporarily with pure perception. During aesthetic contemplation, the observer ceases to exist as a wanting, striving individual and becomes a detached witness to beauty and meaning that requires no personal involvement or achievement. These moments of aesthetic transcendence provide genuine relief from suffering while remaining accessible through cultivation of sensitivity to beauty and meaning in everyday experience. The person can develop aesthetic appreciation through deliberate attention to visual beauty, musical expression, literary insight, and natural phenomena that offer opportunities for transcendent experience within ordinary life circumstances. Aesthetic contemplation requires no special talent or training, but simply willingness to pause regular activities and allow consciousness to be absorbed in beautiful objects or experiences that temporarily eliminate personal concerns and temporal anxiety. The second method emphasizes developing genuine compassion for others through recognition that the same suffering that affects oneself operates throughout all conscious beings. This compassion arises naturally from understanding rather than moral obligation when the person recognizes that individual boundaries are largely illusory and that the will creates similar patterns of dissatisfaction in everyone, regardless of their external circumstances. Compassionate understanding reduces personal suffering by expanding identification beyond individual concerns, while providing meaningful activity through assistance to others who face identical fundamental challenges. True compassion eliminates the competitive dynamics that create much interpersonal suffering by recognizing shared rather than conflicting interests among all conscious beings who struggle with the same basic problems of desire and mortality. Developing compassion requires practicing perspective-taking that recognizes how other people's difficult behaviors often stem from their own suffering rather than malicious intentions or personal inadequacies that justify anger and retaliation. Compassionate response to conflict and difficulty often proves more effective than defensive or aggressive reactions, while providing psychological relief through expanded rather than contracted identification with others' experiences and challenges. The third practical approach involves accepting rather than fighting against the reality of suffering while reducing unnecessary additional suffering created by resistance and denial. This acceptance does not require passive resignation or elimination of appropriate action, but rather recognition that some amount of dissatisfaction and difficulty represents normal features of conscious existence rather than problems that can be permanently solved. Acceptance reduces the secondary suffering created by anger, frustration, and disappointment about the existence of primary suffering that cannot be eliminated through external changes or personal effort. This approach focuses energy on responding skillfully to unavoidable challenges rather than wasting resources on futile attempts to create permanent satisfaction or eliminate all sources of difficulty and disappointment. Practical acceptance involves distinguishing between circumstances that can be influenced through appropriate action and those that require psychological adaptation and emotional regulation rather than external intervention. This discrimination prevents the exhaustion and demoralization that result from applying effort in wrong directions, while increasing effectiveness in areas where action can actually produce meaningful improvement in circumstances or relationships. The fourth method emphasizes reducing unnecessary desires and artificial needs created by social comparison and consumer culture that multiply natural suffering through competitive striving and material accumulation. This voluntary simplicity does not require poverty or asceticism, but rather conscious evaluation of which desires serve genuine needs and which create additional suffering through endless pursuit of status symbols and luxury goods. Reducing artificial desires provides more resources for addressing legitimate needs, while eliminating sources of frustration created by pursuing goals that cannot provide lasting satisfaction even when successfully achieved. This approach requires developing discrimination between natural needs for food, shelter, safety, and companionship versus manufactured wants created by advertising and social pressure that generate dissatisfaction regardless of whether they are fulfilled. Voluntary simplicity often increases rather than decreases life satisfaction by reducing complexity and external pressure while providing more time and energy for relationships and activities that offer genuine rather than artificial sources of meaning and connection. This practice involves conscious resistance to consumer culture while maintaining practical engagement with economic systems necessary for meeting legitimate survival and social needs. The fifth practical approach involves cultivating philosophical understanding of the mechanisms that create suffering as protection against manipulation by psychological and social forces that exploit natural human vulnerabilities. This intellectual understanding provides perspective that reduces reactivity to circumstances and emotions while enabling more conscious choices about where to direct attention and energy. Philosophical reflection reveals how much suffering stems from mistaken beliefs about what will provide satisfaction and meaning, rather than from external circumstances that cannot be controlled or permanently altered. Understanding the psychology of desire and satisfaction prevents many forms of self-deception and impulsive behavior that create additional problems, while offering false promises of eventual relief from fundamental human challenges. Philosophical perspective provides consolation during difficult periods by maintaining awareness of the temporary nature of all experiences and the universality of suffering that affects all conscious beings, regardless of their apparent advantages or achievements. This intellectual approach complements rather than replaces emotional and practical methods, while providing cognitive framework that supports rather than undermines other approaches to reducing suffering and increasing life satisfaction. The sixth method involves developing practices that interrupt habitual patterns of rumination and anxiety through deliberate attention to immediate sensory experience rather than abstract thinking about past and future concerns. These mindfulness techniques reduce suffering by preventing consciousness from elaborating simple situations into complex psychological problems through excessive analysis and emotional amplification. Present moment awareness interrupts the temporal displacement that creates much psychological suffering by maintaining attention on current experience rather than memories and anticipations that exist primarily in imagination. This practice requires developing capacity to observe thoughts and emotions without automatically identifying with their content or believing that every mental event requires immediate action or extended consideration. Mindful awareness reveals how much suffering exists in thinking about experience rather than experience itself, while providing practical methods for reducing mental elaboration that transforms temporary difficulty into permanent psychological problems. These attention practices can be integrated into daily activities without requiring formal meditation or spiritual commitment, while providing immediate relief from many forms of mental suffering that exist primarily in conceptual thinking rather than direct experience. Schopenhauer understood that complete elimination of suffering remains impossible for conscious beings, but that significant reduction in unnecessary suffering can be achieved through practical methods that work with, rather than against, fundamental features of human psychology and social existence. These approaches focus on achievable improvements in life satisfaction, while maintaining realistic expectations about what individual effort can accomplish within the constraints of biological existence and social reality. Practical philosophy offers hope for meaningful progress without requiring faith in ultimate solutions or perfect outcomes that exceed human capacity and natural limitation. The goal remains reduction rather than elimination of suffering through methods that prove effective within ordinary life circumstances, while providing sustainable approaches to managing the challenges that characterize conscious existence regardless of external circumstances or personal achievements. These practical methods offer genuine relief from much unnecessary suffering, while providing framework for accepting unavoidable difficulties with greater equanimity and less additional psychological distress created by resistance and unrealistic expectations about what human life can provide. Understanding and applying these methods represents practical wisdom that improves life quality without requiring complete philosophical transformation or withdrawal from normal social engagement and responsible activity in the world.